The Mediterranean in 1940 was not a sideshow. It was the corridor through which Britain fed its empire east of Suez, through which Italy intended to cement its dominance over what Mussolini called Mare Nostrum, our sea, and through which the entire North African supply chain ran in both directions. Every ton of fuel that reached Rommel's tanks in Libya came through it. Every convoy that kept Malta alive had to cross it. The whole war in that theatre was really a war fought over this one narrow body of water, and the naval battle for it opened on a November night in 1940, with 21 obsolete biplanes lifting off a carrier deck into the dark. The swordfish torpedo bombers that left HMS Illustrious on the night of the 11th of November 1940 were fabric and metal aircraft, with a top speed of around 138 miles per hour, slower than some of the anti-aircraft shells being fired at them. 21 aircraft in 2 waves, each carrying either a single 18-inch torpedo or a bomb load, crossed roughly 170 miles of sea and descended on the Italian fleet at anchor in Taranto harbour. In 65 minutes, 3 Italian battleships, Littorio, Caio Duilio, and Conte di Cavour, had been hit and put out of action. Conte di Cavour sank in the shallows, never returning to full service. The Italian Navy lost half its capital ship strength in a single night. Britain lost 2 aircraft. The entire raid cost fewer than 700 casualties on the Italian side, and yet it shifted naval control of the central Mediterranean so sharply that the Italian fleet moved its surviving ships to Naples the very next day, ceding the sea lanes that Mussolini had promised were his. Every naval planner in Tokyo studied the Taranto raid within weeks. The Japanese naval attaché in Rome filed a report on it. 13 months later, Pearl Harbor followed the same logic at vastly greater scale. Studying the Mediterranean War closely, and I spent most of one research year doing exactly that, working through the convoy records held at the National Maritime Museum. What kept pulling at me was not the battles themselves, but the supply arithmetic underneath them. Malta, the British island fortress sitting 60 miles south of Sicily, needed a minimum of roughly 26,000 tons of supplies per month to function as a military base and sustain its civilian population of roughly 200,000. When Axis air and naval forces eroded the convoy routes through 1941 and into 1942, that number fell to fractions of what the island required. By August 1942, Malta's aviation fuel reserves had dropped so low that the Royal Air Force on the island could barely mount continuous operations. A garrison and a civilian population were both running out of the same thing simultaneously, and the only way to stop either from collapsing was to push a convoy through from the west. Operation Pedestal launched with 14 merchant ships and an escort of 36 warships, including 2 battleships and 4 aircraft carriers, sailing from Gibraltar in August 1942. Axis forces threw everything available at it: German and Italian submarines, E-boats, shore-based aircraft flying from Sicily and Sardinia, and surface warships attempting to intercept from the north. The carrier HMS Eagle was torpedoed and sank in 8 minutes on the 12th of August. A ship of 22,750 tons, gone before most of her crew could reach the deck. By the time the convoy's survivors reached Malta's Grand Harbour on the 15th of August, 9 of the 14 merchant ships had been sunk. More than 500 sailors and merchant seamen were dead. The warship losses included a carrier, 2 cruisers, and a destroyer. But 5 ships got through, and the one that mattered most was the last one in. SS Ohio. An American-built tanker operated under British charter with a British crew had been torpedoed, bombed, and left dead in the water twice during the passage. She arrived in Grand Harbour on the 15th of August, lashed between 2 destroyers, her engine room flooded, her hull cracked, her deck so low in the water that the sea washed across it with every swell. She carried 11,000 tons of aviation fuel. That fuel kept Malta's aircraft flying. Malta's aircraft kept attacking Axis supply convoys to North Africa. Without those 11,000 tons, the island's air capability collapsed. Without that air capability, Rommel's supply lines from Italy ran unmolested. The thread connecting Pedestal to El Alamein is that direct and that fragile. If you are winding down now and the light is low, the whole Mediterranean War is built on moments like that one. A waterlogged tanker dragged into harbour by 2 destroyers, while a crowd on the dockside watched in silence. The convoys, the submarine patrols, the carrier strikes, the harbour raids, the islands held and the islands lost. All of it is in this documentary, from the Taranto night raid to the battered arrival of Ohio in Grand Harbour. This is the entire history of the Mediterranean Naval War, from Taranto to the Pedestal convoy. Benito Mussolini stepped onto the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia at around 6 in the evening on that June day and declared war before a crowd that had been assembled to cheer him. The speech was theatrical, as his speeches always were, full of references to ancient Rome, to the Mediterranean as Italian inheritance, to the hour of destiny that history had finally prepared. The word he used for the Mediterranean was the one that had been used for 2,000 years, Mare Nostrum, our sea. The phrase implied possession, but possession in naval terms requires a fleet that can enforce it, and the men who actually ran the Regia Marina, the admirals at Supermarina headquarters in Rome, had spent the previous several months writing documents that told a rather different story about readiness. The gap between the speech on the balcony and the staff memos in the basement is where the real history of the Italian naval war begins. The Regia Marina in June of 1940 was, on paper, genuinely formidable. The 2 modernized battleships, Conte di Cavour and Giulio Cesare, had been rebuilt almost from the keel upward during the 1930s, their original World War I machinery replaced with modern boilers, their hulls streamlined, their armament upgraded to 10 320mm guns apiece. 2 newer and more powerful ships, Littorio and Vittorio Veneto, had recently completed their sea trials and were among the most technically sophisticated battleships afloat anywhere in the world. The cruiser force was fast and well armed. The destroyer flotillas were numerous. The submarine arm was the 3rd largest on the planet. By any standard measure of naval strength, Italy was a significant maritime power. The British Admiralty's intelligence assessment of May 1940, now accessible at the National Archives at Kew, rated the Italian fleet as an A-class threat, capable of severing the eastern Mediterranean route within 90 days. The assessment was not wrong about the hardware. It was wrong about the will. Beneath the impressive order of battle, there was a fuel problem. Not a minor inconvenience, a structural, strategic, potentially fatal arithmetic problem that the Italian naval staff understood with complete clarity, and that nobody in political leadership appeared willing to address. The Littorio-class battleships, the pride of the fleet, consumed roughly 650 tons of heavy fuel oil per operational hour at full speed across both vessels combined. The entire fleet, maintained at even reduced readiness, required roughly 1,000 tons of oil per day just to keep boilers warm and machinery functional. Italy's oil came almost entirely from Romania and from imports. The pre-war reserve stockpile, according to planning documents that surfaced after the Italian armistice in 1943, would sustain approximately 4 months of sustained fleet operations at wartime tempo. After that, the fleet would need resupply that the war itself might prevent. The admirals knew this. They built their strategy around it, and in building their strategy around it, they effectively decided, before a shot was fired, that the Regia Marina would be a fleet in being rather than a fleet in motion. There is a particular irony in the carrier question that I've never seen adequately explored. In the late 1930s, Supermarina conducted a serious internal debate about whether to convert the passenger liner Roma into a fleet carrier. The proposal was technically viable, the hull dimensions were workable, the the conversion cost was manageable. The argument against it was doctrinal. Italian naval planners believed that land-based aircraft operating from Sicily, Sardinia, the Dodecanese Islands, and the Libyan coast could provide air cover over any area where the fleet might operate. The Mediterranean, they argued, was too small for carriers. The land bases were already there. Why duplicate the capability at sea? This argument was not stupid. In a theoretical sense, it was even correct, provided the fleet intended to operate only within the coverage arc of those land bases. The moment the fleet needed to operate beyond that arc, escorting a convoy through the central Mediterranean at night, for example, or intercepting a British force far from Sicilian airfields, the doctrine failed completely. The Roma was never converted. She was eventually commissioned as a battleship instead, and was sunk by a German-guided bomb in September 1943 after the armistice. The carrier that Italy refused to build haunts this story from the first chapter to the last. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, in the harbour at Alexandria, Egypt, a British admiral was watching and waiting and writing letters about it. Admiral Andrew Brown Cunningham, universally known in the Navy as ABC, had taken command of the Mediterranean fleet in the summer of 1939, before the war began, and he had spent the intervening months learning everything he could about the navy he was going to face. His war diary entry for late June 1940, the weeks immediately after Italy's declaration, records a specific word: puzzling. He found it puzzling, genuinely so, that the Regia Marina was not immediately contesting the eastern Mediterranean. The Italian fleet was numerically superior in cruisers. It had the advantage of interior lines, shorter distances to transit between bases. It had the theoretical ability to cut Britain's supply routes to Egypt and India, which ran through the Suez Canal almost immediately. Instead, it sat. Cunningham spent the next several months testing the theory that the Italian fleet would continue to sit, probing its edges, looking for the behavioral pattern that would tell him what he was actually dealing with. What he was dealing with, in part, was the weight of institutional culture. The Regia Marina had been built and trained around a doctrine that French naval theorist Raoul Castex would have recognized: the fleet in being concept, in which the mere existence of a powerful fleet constrains enemy operations without requiring that fleet to be risked in decisive engagement. It's a coherent theory. The British had used it themselves at various points in their naval history, but the fleet in being doctrine requires a specific condition to work. The enemy must believe that your fleet might engage decisively. If the enemy concludes, through repeated observation, that your fleet will withdraw under pressure, that it will always find a reason not to press the fight, then your fleet's deterrent value collapses. Cunningham was systematically testing this conclusion. The records suggest he had formed his judgment by early August of 1940. He spent the next 2 years proving it. The Italian merchant marine problem was, if anything, even more constraining than the fuel situation. Italy possessed approximately 3,381,000 tons of registered merchant shipping at the outbreak of war. This sounds like a substantial number, but of that total, only around 1,300,000 tons were seagoing cargo vessels deemed operationally suitable for the North African supply run. The route from Italian mainland ports to Tripoli and Benghazi through the central Mediterranean, which passed within range of British aircraft operating from Malta. The gap between declared tonnage and usable tonnage was a number that Italian planning officers understood precisely. Mussolini did not ask about it. In the world of Italian military-political relations in 1940, asking questions that might produce inconvenient answers was an activity that tended to damage careers. So the inconvenient questions accumulated, unasked, while the fleet prepared for a war whose logistical foundation was already compromised. Galeazzo Ciano's diary, kept with a candor that eventually contributed to his execution, records a conversation from mid-June of 1940 in which Mussolini expressed complete confidence that the war would be short. This was not unusual in June of 1940. France had just fallen. Britain appeared, to most informed observers in continental Europe, to be in a desperate position. The reasonable assumption in Rome was that the war would end within months, that Italy would collect its Mediterranean territorial prizes without extended naval commitment, and that the fleet's fuel reserves and merchant tonnage would never be seriously tested. This assumption shaped everything: the reluctance to commit the fleet to aggressive operations, the failure to develop serious convoy protection doctrine, the comfortable belief that the British Mediterranean fleet would soon have more pressing problems than an Italian fleet that largely refused to engage. It was, in the fullest sense, a strategic bet. And it was wrong in every particular except one. The war did eventually end. What Cunningham understood, and what the Italian admirals at Decima Marina either didn't understand or couldn't act upon, was that naval dominance in a confined sea isn't established once, it's contested continuously. Every week that the Regia Marina's battleships sat in Taranto harbour, another convoy moved through the Mediterranean under British escort. Every sortie that the Italian fleet declined to make was another data point in Cunningham's growing certainty about Italian tactical behaviour. History tends to be told forward, as a sequence of causes and effects leading inevitably to known outcomes. But the Mediterranean Naval War of 1940 was being improvised, in real time, by people who didn't know how it would end. What I find fascinating about this opening period is that the most important information being generated wasn't in the battles. There were almost no battles yet. It was in the absences. The convoys that moved unmolested, the sorties that didn't happen, the silence in the middle of a sea that was supposed to be someone's inheritance. Chapter 2. Punta Stilo, the battle that decided nothing. On the 9th of July, 1940, roughly 4 weeks after Italy's declaration of war, the two Mediterranean fleets found each other south of the Calabrian coast. The encounter had been produced by competing convoy operations. The Italians were covering a supply run to North Africa. The British were covering a convoy to Malta and Alexandria. And it escalated, in the manner of all fleet encounters in confined waters, with the measured urgency of two large dogs deciding whether to fight. For about 2 hours, they circled and probed at extreme range, shells falling into the sea between them without achieving much. And then, at roughly 16 minutes to 4 in the afternoon local time, something extraordinary happened. A single 15-inch shell fired by HMS Warspite travelled approximately 26,400 yards, just under 15 miles, and hit the Italian battleship Giulio Cesare, somewhere near the second funnel. What happened next tells you almost everything you need to know about the next 2 years of Mediterranean naval history. Warspite's gunnery log for the 9th of July, held at the National Archives in Kew under the Admiralty series, records the hit with the kind of precision that makes these documents worth spending time with. The range, the bearing, and then one direct hit observed on enemy battleship, written in a neat hand with no change in emphasis, in the same pen as everything else on the page. It reads like a note about a routine drill. What the gunnery log doesn't capture, what no document fully captures, is the physics of what had just happened. The shell had been in the air for approximately 86 seconds. In that time, Giulio Cesare had moved. The fire control computers aboard Warspite had predicted where she would be, at that range, having accounted for wind, temperature, propellant temperature, own ship motion, estimated enemy speed and course, and the curvature of the Earth itself. The probability of a single hit at that range, given 1940 fire control technology, was calculated in post-war analysis at roughly 0.3% per shell. Warspite fired a salvo of 10 shells. One found Giulio Cesare. The mathematics were almost indecent. The hit killed 115 Italian sailors and reduced Giulio Cesare's speed from 28 to 18 knots. Admiral Campioni, commanding the Italian fleet, ordered a withdrawal toward Messina under a smokescreen. The British cruisers, which had been attempting to close the range throughout the engagement, were unable to intercept. The Italian fleet broke off contact and was clear of the engagement area within 30 minutes. Cunningham, aboard Warspite, appears in his war diary to have been more frustrated by the escape than elated by the hit. He had caught a fleet numerically superior in cruisers and failed to bring it to decisive action. The hit was extraordinary. The tactical result was inconclusive. But the strategic result was something else entirely. A behavioral data point that Cunningham filed and kept. The Italian Official History of the Mediterranean Naval War, a multi-volume work produced after the conflict, records that Admiral Campioni's decision to withdraw was tactically sound given the fuel state and the proximity of enemy air bases. This is a reasonable argument. Campioni's cruisers were faster than Cunningham's battleships. Prolonged engagement risked damage that Italian repair facilities could not quickly address. The proximity to land-based air attack was a genuine concern. Cunningham's private letters to the First Sea Lord, written that same week, describe the withdrawal as inexplicable given their numerical advantage in cruisers. Both men are looking at the same geometry. Both are being entirely honest. The disagreement between them is not a factual dispute. It is two different frameworks for assessing acceptable risk, and the gap between those frameworks is the Mediterranean Naval War in miniature. The fire control technology that produced Warspite's hit deserves a paragraph to itself, because it explains something about the power balance that pure ship count comparisons miss. British battleships in 1940 used the Admiralty Fire Control Table Mark I. A mechanical analog computer that weighed more than 3 tons, was housed below the armoured deck, and continuously integrated own ship speed, own ship course, estimated enemy speed, estimated enemy course, wind speed, air temperature, and propellant temperature to produce a constantly updated firing solution. Constantly updated meant it ran continuously, in real time during the engagement, with operators feeding it corrected observations and the table outputting revised firing angles and elevations. The Italian fleet, by contrast, relied on director-controlled gunnery that was technically capable but employed less sophisticated real-time mechanical integration of targeting variables. At short range, say 5,000 yards, this gap was largely irrelevant. Good eyesight and fast reflexes could compensate. At 26,000 yards, with a shell that would spend a minute and a half in the air, the gap between the two systems was the difference between a miss and 115 dead men. I want to sit with those 86 seconds for a moment, because I think they're underappreciated in most accounts of the Battle of Calabria. The shell leaves Warspite's gun at roughly 749 meters per second. It rises to an apogee of approximately 15,000 feet before beginning its long descent. It is, for most of its flight, invisible to anyone on either ship. The Italian anti-aircraft lookouts couldn't see it. The sailors below decks on Giulio Cesare didn't know anything was coming. The gunnery officers on Warspite couldn't see whether it had landed for at least 60 seconds after firing. The splash, at that distance, was at the limit of optical resolution with 1940 binoculars. For a minute and a half, an 89-kilogram steel projectile was traveling 15 miles through the Mediterranean afternoon, and everyone on both ships was doing something else entirely. Watching the smokescreen, tracking bearings, waiting. History pivoting on 86 unobserved seconds. Giulio Cesare was repaired within 6 weeks. The hit had been severe, but not fatal. She was back in service by late August of 1940 and remained technically operational for the rest of the Italian Naval War. What didn't recover, in the weeks after Calabria, was the Italian Navy's institutional appetite for fleet engagement. Supermarina's after-action analysis focused on the danger of operating battleships within range of enemy carrier aircraft. The Fleet Air-Armed torpedo bombers from HMS Eagle had mounted an attack during the battle that, although it achieved nothing, had demonstrated the threat. The analysis was not wrong, but it produced a conclusion that compounded the doctrinal caution already built into Italian naval planning. Engage the enemy only when conditions are favourable. The problem was that conditions, in the Mediterranean in 1940 and 1941, were rarely favourable. The British kept showing up. Mussolini's reaction to Calabria was recorded by Ciano in his diary the following day. The characterization of the admirals as shrimp fishermen has been quoted enough times in Mediterranean war histories that it has almost become decorative. What strikes me as more revealing is the context. Mussolini wasn't analysing the tactical situation, wasn't asking about fuel constraints or fire control systems, wasn't engaging with the actual reasons why the fleet had withdrawn. He was reacting to the humiliation of a result that he could not present as a victory. This pattern, political leadership responding to military results with emotional reaction rather than analytical adjustment, is visible throughout Italian Mediterranean operations, and it created a feedback loop that made rational strategic adaptation almost impossible. The admirals couldn't explain the fuel problem without risking their careers. Mussolini couldn't hear the fuel problem without revising his strategic assumptions. So nobody talked about the fuel problem, and the fleet continued sitting at anchor in Taranto, looking formidable while Cunningham took notes. 6 Italian heavy cruisers were present at the Battle of Calabria and never once closed to effective gun range. A standing Super Marina order, in force at the time of the engagement, prohibited cruiser commanders from exposing their vessels to battleship fire without explicit authorization from Fleet Command. This order was not unreasonable in itself. Cruisers against battleships, at battle range, are generally a poor exchange. But combined with the fleet's overall tendency to withdraw under pressure, it meant that Italy's most numerous and fastest major surface combatants spent the engagement as spectators. Post-war Italian analysis acknowledged this. The standing order remained in force, substantially unchanged, through the Battle of Cape Matapan in March of 1941. The pattern, once established, proved remarkably durable. The battle ended. Both fleets returned to port. No ships had been sunk. Both sides claimed they had achieved their convoy escort objectives. In a narrow sense, both were correct. In the broader sense of what the engagement established, about Italian tactical behaviour, about British fire control superiority, about the behavioural template that would govern every subsequent fleet encounter in the Mediterranean, Calabria was one of the most consequential, inconclusive battles in naval history. Cunningham had his pattern. The Italian fleet had confirmed it, and somewhere in the Super Marina war diary, a staff officer wrote up the action with the careful, neutral language of institutional self-protection and filed it and went home. Chapter 3. The Ledger of the Middle Sea. Logistics as Destiny. This is the chapter without a hero. There's no ship that fires the decisive gun, no pilot who turns the battle, no admiral who outthinks his counterpart in the crucial hour. What this chapter has is a table. Actually, several tables, recovered by Allied intelligence after the Italian armistice of September 1943, from the files of the Italian Ministry of Marine Transport. And they are among the most important historical documents of the Second World War. Nobody reads them. They aren't dramatic. They are columns of numbers representing monthly Axis merchant ship losses in the Mediterranean, from June of 1940 through the summer of 1942. And they tell the whole story of the Mediterranean War in the most unambiguous terms possible. The war wasn't decided by any single battle. It was decided by these numbers, and the numbers were legible to anyone who was willing to look at them, almost from the beginning. The basic arithmetic of Axis supply in North Africa ran as follows. Rommel's forces, the Africa Corps and the Italian divisions alongside them, required a minimum of roughly 60,000 tons of supplies per month to sustain operations. Fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, vehicles, replacement personnel. This figure wasn't a wish. It was the calculated minimum for basic functionality. The route from Italian mainland ports to Tripoli and Benghazi ran through the central Mediterranean, past Malta, under the arc of Royal Navy and RAF aircraft. In the first serious period of convoy interdiction, roughly November of 1940 through February of 1941, the average loss rate for Axis shipping on this route reached approximately 27% of all goods dispatched. Not 27% of ships, 27% of goods. More than one shipment in 4 was being sent to the bottom. Rommel was receiving somewhere around 60% of his stated requirements during this period. He was furious about it. His war diary says so in terms that leave no room for diplomatic interpretation. What makes the Italian ministry tables particularly interesting is a specific discrepancy that surfaces when you cross-reference them against Rommel's own quartermaster records. Italian convoy reports, filed through the chain of command to Super Marina and thence to the relevant government ministries, consistently overstated delivered tonnage by somewhere between 8 and 15%. The German quartermasters in North Africa, who were physically counting what arrived at the docks, kept their own figures. The two sets of numbers don't match, and they diverge in a direction that suggests Italian logistical reporting was being adjusted before transmission upward through the command structure. Whether this was conscious falsification or accumulated optimistic rounding is something the archives don't definitively settle. The practical effect was that Italian military and political leadership in Rome was receiving a picture of supply delivery that was meaningfully better than the reality Rommel's men were experiencing in the field. Decisions were being made on the basis of numbers that didn't correspond to any physical reality in the Libyan desert. This is not a minor administrative failure. It is a mechanism by which a military organization loses its ability to see itself clearly, and it was operating continuously throughout the Mediterranean campaign. The British Naval Intelligence Division at the Admiralty had, by late 1940, developed an internal metric that the released files at Q describe as an Axis Supply Effectiveness Index. It was a monthly calculation, estimated Axis material demand for North Africa against estimated delivery, yielding a percentage that represented how much of what Rommel needed was actually reaching him. When this index fell below 55%, British commanders in Cairo received instruction to prepare for offensive ground operations within 90 days, on the assessment that Axis defensive capacity would be critically degraded. This sounds sophisticated, a peacetime management consultant's tool dropped into a shooting war. But it worked. It was directionally accurate almost every time it predicted a window of Axis vulnerability, because it was measuring the right thing. Not Rommel's tactical brilliance or British operational planning, but the rate at which Rommel's logistical foundation was being eroded. The tool understood that the war in the desert was, at its root, a supply chain problem. The specific event that makes this abstraction concrete is the interception of the convoy known in Italian records as the Taranto convoy on the 16th of April, 1941. 4 British destroyers, operating at night from Malta, encountered 5 Italian merchant ships and their 3 destroyer escort. The engagement lasted a matter of hours. When it was over, all 5 merchant ships and 2 of the 3 escorts had been sunk. The cargo manifest, 3,796 tons of ammunition, 350 vehicles, approximately 300 German soldiers, was at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Rommel's diary for the following weeks records increasing complaints about ammunition shortfalls that specifically constrained his ability to sustain pressure on the British defensive positions at Tobruk. The 4 British destroyers that sank that convoy in a single night action had not fired at Rommel. They had fired at his mathematics. Malta's role in this logistics attrition is central enough that it demands its own explanation, because it's easy to describe the island as simply a base and miss what that base actually represented in geometric terms. Malta sits at the narrowest point of the central Mediterranean, roughly equidistant between Sicily to the north and Tunisia and Libya to the south. The crossing from Italian ports to Tripoli runs through a channel approximately 90 to 100 nautical miles wide at Malta's longitude. Aircraft operating from Malta could cover essentially the entire width of this channel. Submarines based at Malta could patrol the approaches. Surface ships based at Malta could intercept at night. The island was not strategically important because of what it contained in itself. It had no oil, no significant industrial capacity, limited agricultural production. It was strategically important because of its location relative to the only route by which Rommel's supplies could reach him. Control Malta, and you hold a knife against every supply artery feeding the Axis army in North Africa. Lose Malta, and those arteries run free. The British supply situation ran in the opposite direction from the Axis supply crisis, and understanding this contrast is essential to understanding why the Mediterranean War went as it did. The Western Desert Force, later the Eighth Army, was receiving supplies via Alexandria at an average of roughly 60,000 tons per month by mid-1941, delivered through a supply chain that ran around the Cape of Good Hope from Britain, Australia, India, and the United States. This route was longer, vastly longer, than the Italian supply route from Naples to Tripoli. It was also almost entirely unmolested. The Axis had no equivalent of Malta sitting astride the Cape route, no submarine force capable of sustained interdiction operations in the Indian Ocean at scale, no land-based air power that could cover the convoys rounding the Cape. While Rommel's quartermasters were counting every case of ammunition that arrived short weight from Italian ports, Montgomery's predecessors were drowning in materiel. The asymmetry was structural, and no amount of tactical brilliance on either side could overcome it indefinitely. I want to be careful here not to reduce the Mediterranean War to a deterministic exercise in which the outcome was inevitable from the moment Italy declared war. It wasn't. There were numerous points at which Axis decisions could have shifted the supply balance significantly. A more aggressive submarine campaign against the Cape route. A commitment to actually invading and taking Malta, which the Axis had both the capability and the opportunity to do in 1942. A serious German investment in Mediterranean air power earlier than late 1940. None of these happened for reasons that mix strategic miscalculation, command disagreements, competing priorities, and the simple difficulty of conducting operations across 3 services and 2 national militaries that spoke different languages and operated on different planning cycles. The logistics history is not destiny. It is the accumulated consequence of a long series of decisions, most of them made for reasons that seemed locally sensible at the time. By mid-1941, the Italian merchant tanker fleet dedicated to North African supply had been reduced from roughly 23 operational vessels to approximately 11 through losses and damage. Aviation fuel delivery to Axis airfields in Libya fell below 40% of minimum stated requirements by August of that year. Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica units stationed in Libya began rationing operational sorties. Not because their pilots were unwilling, not because their aircraft were technically inferior, but because the tankers that should have been bringing fuel from Italian ports to Tripoli were sitting on the Mediterranean seabed. And those tankers were on the seabed because of submarines and destroyers based at Malta. The chain of cause and effect runs in one direction, cleanly, from the logistics spreadsheets to the fuel depots, to the airfield dispersal areas, to the convoy routes in the central Mediterranean. The Mediterranean War was a war of columns and tables, and the columns told the story 3 months before any battle did. The number that matters most when you step back from all the individual engagements and convoys and operations is this. Between June of 1940 and the fall of Tunisia in May of 1943, the Axis lost 342 merchant vessels in the Mediterranean, totaling approximately 1,299,777 tons. Italy's shipyard replacement construction capacity during this period never exceeded 80,000 tons per year. The arithmetic doesn't close. It never could close. Every ton sent to the bottom represented either a shell that wasn't fired, a vehicle that wasn't replaced, a soldier who went hungry, or a tank that sat immobile for want of fuel. The ledger of the Middle Sea was written in cargo manifests and loss registers, not in dispatches from battle, and it was the most honest document of the entire war. Chapter 4. Operation Judgment. 21 Swordfishes against the fleet. The Fleet Air Arm Museum at Yeovilton holds a mission briefing sheet for Operation Judgment that I find quietly astonishing every time I look at it. It lists the aircraft assigned to the Taranto raid by letter designation, L4A through L4P, alongside their fuel loads and torpedo settings. The pilots and observers who would fly those aircraft are reduced, on this sheet, to administrative alphanumerics. The document is professional and precise. It is also, in retrospect, a record of one of the most improbable operations in the history of naval aviation. 21 fabric-covered biplanes, designed in 1934, preparing to attack a modern fleet of battleships and cruisers behind defensive nets and barrage balloons in one of the most heavily defended harbours in the Mediterranean. Post-war probability calculations put the survival rate for the low-level torpedo runs at below 50%. The briefing sheet doesn't mention this figure anywhere. Perhaps that was mercy. HMS Illustrious launched the first wave of 12 swordfish at approximately 20 minutes past 8 in the evening on the 11th of November, 1940. The date wasn't chosen for symbolic reasons. It was the night when reconnaissance photographs confirmed sufficient moonlight for navigation over the harbour, combined with a fleet disposition that presented viable torpedo targets. 6 aircraft carried Mark 12 aerial torpedoes. The other 6 carried flares and bombs. Their job was to illuminate the harbour and draw anti-aircraft fire, while the torpedo aircraft made their runs. The Swordfish was, by 1940 standards, a museum piece in the air. Its maximum speed was 90 knots. Modern Italian fighter aircraft could reach 280 knots. The Swordfish relied on the cover of darkness and the near impossibility of an effective night fighter interception without airborne radar, which the Italian Air Force didn't have. The plan was audacious in the way that only plans built on very specific technical calculations can be. Not reckless, but dependent on a chain of precise conditions, each holding simultaneously. The central technical challenge of attacking Taranto harbour wasn't the anti-aircraft defences, or the searchlights, or the barrage balloon cables, though all of these were serious problems. The central challenge was water depth. Standard naval torpedoes in 1940 dove to between 20 and 40 feet after entering the water before levelling off on their running depth. Parts of Taranto harbour were only 40 feet deep. A torpedo dropped from a standard release altitude would bury itself in the harbour floor well before reaching any target. The Fleet Air Arms solution was characteristically improvised and characteristically effective. A wooden running depth control modification fitted to the Mark 12 torpedo, combined with a mandatory launch altitude of no more than 30 feet above the water surface and a precise approach speed of exactly 90 knots. The modification was a wooden batten and an adjusted hydrostatic valve. It weighed approximately 2.5 pounds. It was, in material terms, almost nothing. In strategic terms, it was the object that changed the balance of the Mediterranean War in a single night. The attack itself unfolded over roughly an hour. in two waves separated by approximately an hour's interval. The first wave caught the Italian defences partly unprepared. The second wave, arriving after the harbour was fully alerted, flew through a curtain of anti-aircraft fire that pilots described as almost solid. 3 Italian battleships were struck. Conte di Cavour sank at her moorings, with a torpedo hole below her forward turret. Caio Duilio settled to the harbour floor, with flooded forward compartments. Littorio, one of the most modern battleships in the world, took 2 torpedoes and settled in shallow water, her hull severely damaged. British losses were 2 aircraft. The pilot of one of them, Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson, who had led the first wave, was shot down after his torpedo run and survived to become a prisoner of war in a facility on the edge of the harbour he had just attacked. The reconnaissance photographs taken the following morning by a Fleet Air Arm aircraft operating from Eagle were analysed at the Photographic Interpretation Unit at Medmenham. The interpreters could see the battleship's changed waterlines, the oil spreading from Conte di Cavour, the altered trim of Littorio. Their assessment identified 3 battleships struck and 2 effectively sunk. The Italian Navy's initial damage report to Super Marina, recovered after the armistice and now in Italian naval archives, acknowledged 3 battleships damaged, but described the damage as repairable within weeks. The Conte di Cavour was raised, sent to Trieste for rebuilding, and was still in the repair yard on the 8th of September 1943 when Italy surrendered. She never returned to service. Repairable within weeks was either institutional optimism or conscious misreporting. The archival evidence doesn't settle which, but the gap between that assessment and the reality of a battleship that spent 3 years in dry dock without returning to combat speaks for itself. Williamson's post-war debrief with the Admiralty, filed in 1946, contains a passage that doesn't appear in the standard histories of Taranto. He describes being held in a facility from which he could see portions of the harbour, and an Italian officer, apparently unaware of who Williamson was, showing him a photograph of the damaged harbour area. The officer's comment, in English, was something like, "You see, all ruined." He meant it as an indictment. Williamson understood it as a battle damage assessment. The anecdote is useful not as a dramatic flourish, but as a reminder that the raid's consequences were visible and immediate in ways that strategic histories sometimes obscure. The man who had launched the attack was now watching its results from the losing side's perspective, in a harbour that still smelled of cordite and fuel oil. That specific inversion, attacker become witness, prisoner watching the aftermath of his own action, is not something you can reconstruct from official records. It's what the debrief is for. The Japanese connection to Taranto is thoroughly documented and deserves direct treatment, because it is sometimes presented as a matter of speculation when it is in fact a matter of archival record. The Japanese naval attaché in Rome, following the Taranto raid, filed a detailed intelligence report to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. The report was 47 pages and included specific analysis of the torpedo modification techniques that made the shallow water attack possible, precisely the technical problem that Japanese naval planners were working through in their own planning for a potential attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The Taranto files, marked in Japanese classification as sensitive intelligence, were found intact in Tokyo after the Japanese surrender in 1945. The American naval officer who reviewed them noted that the shallow water torpedo solution described in the Japanese analysis of Taranto was identical, in its essential principles, to the solution used at Pearl Harbor 13 months later. Taranto was not just a British victory, it was a technical manual, and the Japanese had been taking notes. The carrier question comes back here with particular force. HMS Illustrious, which had launched the Taranto raid, was built with an armoured flight deck, a British design choice that had been criticised by American naval architects before the war for sacrificing aircraft capacity in favor of protection. A standard Illustrious-class carrier could operate approximately 36 aircraft. A comparable American Yorktown-class carrier, with its wooden flight deck, could operate 80-odd. The British were trading capacity for survivability, and in the context of pre-war fleet doctrine, which assumed carriers would operate in the teeth of enemy fleet action and surface gunfire, the armoured deck made sense. On the 10th of January, 1941, roughly 2 months after Taranto, Illustrious was hit by 6 500-kilogram bombs from German Ju-88s operating from Sicily. She suffered catastrophic fires, lost part of her flight deck structure, and took on significant water. She survived to reach Malta under her own power, then Alexandria for temporary repairs, then the United States for full reconstruction. A carrier with an unarmoured deck would almost certainly not have reached Malta. The design decision made in British shipyards in the mid-1930s had just been tested under the most extreme possible conditions, and it had held. The aftermath of Taranto produced a shift in the balance of Mediterranean naval power that is easy to state and difficult to fully grasp. Before the 11th of November 1940, the Italian battle fleet comprised 6 operational battleships. After that night, it comprised effectively 3: Vittorio Veneto, Giulio Cesare, and Conte di Cavour's undamaged sister, Andrea Doria. The ability of the Regia Marina to project surface power across the central Mediterranean was halved. But the more significant consequence was behavioural, not arithmetical. The Italian battle fleet had been attacked in its most secure anchorage, behind nets and balloons and anti-aircraft guns, and been found wanting. If Taranto wasn't safe, nowhere was safe. The psychological weight of that conclusion shaped Italian fleet operations for the rest of the war, a further deepening of the institutional caution that Calabria had already established, now reinforced by the visceral memory of a harbour attack that had seemed impossible right up until the moment it wasn't. Cunningham's response to the Taranto result was characteristically measured. His diary records satisfaction at the tactical outcome, and immediate concern about what came next, specifically whether the damaged battleships could be repaired quickly and whether the Italian fleet would respond with increased aggression. Neither concern fully materialized. The battleships took far longer to repair than Italian reports had suggested they would. The fleet's response to Taranto was not increased aggression, but a redeployment of the surviving battleships to more northerly ports, away from the range of carrier aircraft based at Malta and Egypt. 21 biplanes, flying at 90 knots through a Mediterranean night, had just rearranged the Italian Navy's home port geography. Chapter 5. The Ghost Fleet, Admiral Cunningham's Private War. There is a letter in the British Library's Cunningham Papers, additional manuscript 52,559, that I want to read carefully, because it is one of the most revealing documents in the entire Mediterranean archive. It is dated October of 1940, addressed to the First Sea Lord, Admiral Dudley Pound, and it opens with the standard naval courtesies, the formal address, the acknowledgement of recent correspondence. And then, in the 3rd paragraph, the language changes. I am daily amazed, Cunningham writes, that London appears to believe I can project force at 3 points simultaneously, with a fleet that has not had a proper refit in 14 months. Not a complaint, an engineering argument dressed as a complaint. The fleet is a machine. Machines require maintenance. This machine has been running without maintenance for over a year. The consequences are calculable. Here they are. That's Cunningham in his private voice, precise, methodical, and about 3 degrees of temperature warmer than his official dispatches. The public Cunningham, the one who appears in official signals and fleet orders and Admiralty correspondence, wrote in the measured, unsentimental language of naval administration. His dispatches are models of the form: clear, specific, free of unnecessary detail, and almost entirely free of anything that might be read as uncertainty or anxiety. This was deliberate. Cunningham understood, with complete clarity, that his role was not to transmit his internal state to the Admiralty, but to represent the fleet as a functioning instrument of national policy. A commander who expressed doubt in official channels provided ammunition to those in London who might use that doubt to justify reducing his resources or constraining his operations. So the official Cunningham was always managing expectations, managing London's tendency to treat the Mediterranean fleet as an inexhaustible resource, managing the gap between what was being asked of him and what was physically possible. The private letters are where he told the truth. The truth, in the autumn and winter of 1940, was that the Mediterranean fleet was running on institutional momentum and not much else. The ships had been at operational tempo for 15 consecutive months by the time of Taranto. The Admiralty's standard maintenance cycle was built around an 18-month schedule: 6 months of operations, 4 months in a major dockyard, return to operations. Cunningham's fleet had not had a major dockyard refit since before the war. The specific consequence that he identified in his private correspondence was wear in boiler tubes, a component that degrades gradually under sustained high-pressure use, and, when it fails, causes a measurable reduction in a ship's maximum achievable speed. By his own estimate, at least 4 of his major warships were operating with compromised boiler tube integrity by early 1941. Their stated maximum speed was 25 knots. Their actual maximum was probably 19 or 20 on the ships he was most concerned about. Fleet speed, the ability to close with an enemy or escape a superior force, was being degraded by deferred maintenance, silently, while the official records reported the fleet as fully operational. The arrival of the German Fliegerkorps 10 in Sicily in late 1940 changed the operational equation in a way that Cunningham immediately recognized. The diary entry for the 11th of January 1941, the day after Illustrious was bombed, contains 3 words that I keep returning to as the most compressed strategic assessment in the entire archive. The club has changed. Not the situation has deteriorated, not the air threat has increased significantly. 3 words. The Luftwaffe units arriving in Sicily were not improvising their anti-shipping role. They had been specifically trained for it in Norway, where they had demonstrated the capacity to sink modern warships at sea. Their aircraft, Junkers Ju-88s and Heinkel He-111 torpedo bombers, were faster, better armed, and operated by crews who knew exactly what they were doing. The Italian air forces had been a serious threat to ships at sea. The German air forces were a different category of problem entirely. Me reading Cunningham's papers is an exercise in understanding the management of impossible positions. He was operating under 3 simultaneous and contradictory pressures. London wanted him to be aggressive, to contest Italian convoy traffic to North Africa, to protect Malta, to maintain the eastern Mediterranean supply routes open, to support the army in the western desert. His fleet's actual operational state required caution and maintenance time that aggressive operations wouldn't allow. And the arrival of German air power in Sicily had just raised the cost of any aggressive surface operation significantly above its previous level. He couldn't satisfy all 3 imperatives simultaneously. He could only manage the sequence in which he disappointed each of them. His private letters to Pound are, in essence, a running record of that sequencing, which demand he was currently prioritizing, which ones he was deferring, and what he needed from London to close the gap between the possible and the required. The ultra-intelligent system, the Bletchley Park code-breaking operation that was producing decrypted German and Italian signals, was by early 1941 beginning to provide Cunningham with operational intelligence of extraordinary value. The problem was that he couldn't use it directly. If the Italians or Germans noticed that British forces were responding with suspicious precision to operations that had been communicated only in encrypted signals, they would conclude that their codes were being read, change them, and the intelligence advantage would evaporate. Every piece of ultra-derived intelligence had to be laundered through a plausible alternative source before it could be acted upon. A reconnaissance aircraft that happened to spot an Italian convoy, a radio intercept that happened to pick up a transmission in lower-grade cipher, a floating mine that happened to be found near the reported route. Cunningham had to maintain the fiction of not knowing what he knew every time he acted on the intelligence. The administrative and operational burden of this deception ran parallel to every fleet operation throughout 1941, invisible to everyone except the small circle of officers cleared to know about Ultra. In March of 1941, the deception reached its most elaborate expression. Ultra intelligence indicated that the Italian fleet was planning a major operation in the eastern Mediterranean, an attack on British convoy traffic between Alexandria and Greece, with a force that included the battleship Vittorio Veneto. Cunningham needed to respond, but he needed his response to appear to be based on something other than decoded signals. The cover story he constructed was a floatplane reconnaissance that had spotted the Italian fleet at sea. To make this plausible, a floatplane actually had to fly the relevant area at the relevant time. The patrol report was written to describe a chance sighting. Italian intelligence, monitoring British movements from agents in Alexandria, needed to observe Cunningham's fleet behaving as if it had just received news from a reconnaissance aircraft, not from a codebreaker in Buckinghamshire. This is why Cunningham went ashore on the evening before his fleet sailed, carrying a suitcase and what his staff later described as a golf bag, creating the visual impression that the commander-in-chief was planning nothing more urgent than dinner and a round of golf. Italian agents watching the harbour saw an admiral going out for the evening. 3 battleships left harbour quietly after dark. The image of Cunningham with a golf bag, used as an instrument of strategic deception, is almost comic, and I think that's part of its value as a historical detail. It reminds you that intelligence operations in 1941 were conducted by human beings in physical environments, not by algorithms in data centers, and that their success depended on mundane, specific theatrical details. A suitcase, a golf bag, a man walking down a gangplank at the right moment. The sophisticated machinery of Ultra, the mathematical work at Bletchley, the wireless intercept stations, the decryption teams, the secure courier systems that moved the intelligence to commanders in the field, was ultimately dependent on the human performance of ordinariness. An admiral going to dinner. Nothing to see. Cunningham had been offered command of the home fleet in late 1940, a larger command, better equipped ships, proximity to Britain, a fundamentally less impossible operational situation. He declined. The explanation he gave in a private note to his wife was that the Mediterranean fleet has not yet done what it must do. He didn't specify what that was. Looking at what happened in the 3 months following the offer, Taranto, Matapan, the Crete evacuation, you could argue that he knew precisely what it was and had already begun calculating the path to achieve it. Or you could argue that this is the kind of statement people make when they feel a specific attachment to a command and are rationalizing a personal choice in terms of duty. The archives don't settle it either way. I'm not sure history should have to. The Mediterranean fleet that Cunningham commanded through 1940 and 1941 wasn't, in any objective sense, a superior fighting force. It was, at various points, outgunned in cruisers, outmatched in air power, understrength in destroyers, running on deferred maintenance and stretched supply chains. What it had was a commander who understood, very precisely, the difference between the position he was actually in and the position that London's dispatches described him as being in, and who managed that gap with enough precision and nerve to keep the fleet operational, and operational, and operational, through every demand placed on it. He wasn't always right. He made errors that cost ships. But the fleet held together through 2 years of punishment that would have broken a command less carefully managed. And in the end, it held together long enough to matter. Chapter 6. Matapan. The Midnight Reckoning. There is a signal log from the Government Code and Cipher School, dated the 22nd of March, 1941, that opens with a decoded Italian naval signal authorizing a major fleet operation in the eastern Mediterranean. The text of the decoded signal is brief and operational. Routes, times, force composition. In the margin of the log, written in pencil in a hand that archivists have attributed to the cryptanalyst Mavis Beatty, are 4 words. This is the one. Beatty was 21 years old. She had broken the Italian Hagelin cipher traffic several days before this signal arrived. She had been waiting for exactly this kind of operational signal, something specific enough, consequential enough, to justify the risk of acting on the intelligence. When it came, she wrote 4 words in the margin of a government document and then went and found her supervisor. The Battle of Cape Matapan, in which 3 Italian heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers were destroyed, and 2,300 men died, began in the margin of that document on the 22nd of March, 6 days before a single gun was fired. The Italian Hagelin C-38M cipher machine was a Swedish-designed, theoretically non-repeating mechanical cipher that produced, under ideal conditions, an extremely resistant encryption. The specific vulnerability that Beatty found was not in the machine. It was in the people using it. Italian naval operators were applying standardized message formats, stock preambles, and routine closings that appeared in predictable positions in every signal, that provided what codebreakers called cribs. A crib is a known piece of plaintext against which the cipher can be attacked. If you know that every Italian naval signal begins with a specific formal greeting in a specific format, then you know approximately what the first 20 characters of the ciphertext represent in plain language, and that known relationship gives you a foothold into the mathematical structure of the cipher. The machine was sound, the operating procedure wasn't. Beatty found the weakness in the procedure and used it to open the machine. This category of cryptographic vulnerability, what modern cybersecurity professionals call operator error at the cryptographic layer, remains the most common failure point in encrypted communications today. The specific technology has changed. The human tendency to prioritize convenience over procedure has not. Cunningham received the intelligence with the now familiar challenge of using it without revealing its source. The cover story constructed in Alexandria was a floatplane reconnaissance, as in the planning for previous operations. But the challenge this time was more complex, because Italian intelligence agents monitoring Alexandria harbour had been reporting British fleet movements for months, and any unusual sailing would prompt questions. Cunningham's solution was the dinner and golf bag deception described in his staff's later accounts. A public evening ashore, the deliberate appearance of a commander with no urgent business, and then 3 battleships slipping quietly out of harbour after dark. The intelligence-derived nature of his knowledge required him to perform normalcy while simultaneously preparing for one of the most decisive naval actions of the war. That is a specific kind of cognitive demand, maintaining a public performance while running an internal calculation, that doesn't appear anywhere in the official histories of Matapan, but is visible in every account written by people who were there. The days between the 22nd of March, when the intelligence arrived, and the 28th, when the battle was fought, were spent in the kind of careful operational preparation that the later drama of the engagement tends to obscure. Ships were fueled, ammunition was checked, The floatplane crew that would fly the chance reconnaissance was briefed. The destroyer force was positioned. The timing of the fleet's departure from Alexandria was calibrated to arrive at the interception point at an hour that gave Cunningham maximum tactical advantage. Specifically, darkness for the surface engagement, with enough morning light afterward to conduct a search for survivors. These calculations were routine naval staff work, invisible in the final account. But without them, the battle doesn't happen in the form it did. Matapan was won at sea on the 28th of March. It was planned in extraordinary detail in the week before. The engagement itself, during the afternoon of the 28th, began with the Italian battleship Vittorio Veneto being intercepted by British cruisers and a swordfish torpedo attack from the carrier Formidable. The torpedo attack was only partially successful. One hit, which damaged Vittorio Veneto, but didn't stop her. But it was enough to force the Italian fleet to begin withdrawal toward Taranto. During this withdrawal, the heavy cruiser Pola was hit by another torpedo, stopped dead in the water, and went dark. Admiral Cunningham, commanding the Italian 1st Cruiser Division, received orders from Fleet Command: return and assist Pola. Cunningham followed his orders. He turned back with 2 heavy cruisers, Zara and Fiume, and 4 destroyers. He had no radar. He didn't know that 3 British battleships were following his track in the darkness. What happened between approximately 2200 and 2240 on the evening of the 28th of March is recorded in the British action reports with the spare efficiency of men who had trained their whole lives for moments they hoped would never arrive. HMS Barham, Warspite, and Valiant came up on Zara and Fiume at a range of approximately 3,500 yards, roughly 2 miles. In naval gun terms, this is point blank. Searchlights illuminated the 2 Italian cruisers. For a moment, a few seconds perhaps, the scene would have been almost theatrical. The white light catching the Italian ships' profiles in total clarity, the silence before the first salvo. Then, the British battleships opened fire. Post-war analysis estimated that Zara and Fiume absorbed approximately 107 15-inch shells between them before sinking. Cunningham went down with Zara. His last recorded communication was a position report. He was still navigating, still trying to fulfill his mission, in the last minutes before his ship ceased to exist. The source conflict in the Matapan accounts is one that I think needs to be addressed rather than papered over. British action reports, filed with the Admiralty, state that standard challenge procedure was followed before opening fire on the Italian cruisers. That is, that the normal naval challenge was issued and ignored before the guns opened. Italian survivor accounts, collected after the war by the Ufficio Storico della Marina Militare, describe the searchlights and the first salvo as effectively simultaneous, with no discernible gap between illumination and fire. The timing recorded in the British gunnery logs does not clearly support the British version's implication of a meaningful procedural pause. I'm not raising this to impugn the Royal Navy's conduct at Matapan. The action was a legitimate engagement of enemy warships in wartime. I raise it because the discrepancy is there, it's documented, and the habit of smoothing over source conflicts in favour of the winning side's account is precisely the kind of thing that makes military history less trustworthy than it should be. British destroyers spent several hours after the main action searching for survivors. Cunningham's dispatch records approximately 900 Italian sailors recovered from the water. The search was terminated when a German submarine was reported in the area, a genuine operational threat that couldn't be ignored. Before ending the search, Cunningham transmitted the position of Italian survivors to Italian Naval Command, and an Italian hospital ship, Gradisca, was subsequently dispatched to the area. This was not required by any regulation Cunningham was operating under. It was a decision made by a man in the middle of a naval battle who chose, at a moment when he might have chosen otherwise, to extend a courtesy to the enemy that cost him nothing militarily, and saved an unknown number of lives. His dispatch records it as a routine operational note. His private papers don't mention it at all. It's in the record because it happened, not because anyone at the time thought it particularly notable. The Italian fleet never fully recovered from Matapan, not in the material sense. The lost cruisers could, in theory, have been replaced, and the battle losses were not individually fatal to Italian naval strength. The damage was institutional. Taranto had demonstrated that the fleet wasn't safe in harbour. Matapan demonstrated that it wasn't safe at sea either, that it could be tracked, anticipated, and destroyed in the dark by an enemy who always seemed to know precisely where it was going to be. The Italian Naval Command understood, after Matapan, that their communications were somehow compromised, though they couldn't identify how. They changed procedures. They added cipher layers. They increased discipline around signal handling. None of it fully addressed the underlying vulnerability, because the underlying vulnerability was in the habits of operators who had been trained before the war in procedures that Bletchley had learned to exploit. The Italian Navy went to war with the doctrine it had built in peacetime, and by March of 1941, it was paying the accumulated cost of that mismatch. 2,300 Italian sailors died at Matapan. Most of them were aboard Zara and Fiume in the 11 minutes of point-blank fire that ended both ships. They had been following orders, sound orders actually, by the doctrine they'd been trained in. Cataneo's decision to return to Pola was exactly what Italian naval standing orders required. The tragedy of Matapan, from the Italian perspective, is that the men who died were not defeated by superior tactics or superior seamanship in any direct sense. They were defeated by a 21-year-old woman in a hut in Buckinghamshire who found a weakness in a Swedish cipher machine, and by the chain of intelligent, careful, entirely hidden work that translated that weakness into an ambush in the dark. Cataneo never knew Mavis Beatty existed. He never could have known. The two of them were connected by an invisible thread of mathematics and paper and lamp oil burning late in a wartime country house, and neither of them knew the other was pulling at the other end. Chapter 7. Blood on the Olive Sea. Crete and the Fleet's Sacrifice. There is an after-action report filed by HMS Kipling in late May of 1941 that I have read several times, and each time I reach the same paragraph near the middle of the document. The language up to that point is the standard naval prose: bearings, speeds, times, weather conditions. Then, describing the recovery of survivors from HMS Kelly after she went down, the report breaks its own form. The number of men in the water, it states, was beyond the capacity of this ship to recover in the time available. Many were left. 6 words at the end. Many were left. After that, the report returns to its standard form, as if the sentence hadn't just described something that cannot be adequately processed in the language of after-action reports. The writer clearly knew the form was insufficient. He used it anyway, because that was the tool available. The battle for Crete was full of moments like this. Moments where the event exceeded the administrative language created to describe it. The campaign in Crete in May of 1941 was, from the Royal Navy's perspective, a compound of 2 simultaneous and contradictory missions. The first was preventing German reinforcement of the island by sea, which the Navy accomplished, at considerable cost, with a near-total interception of German seaborne troop convoys that drowned several thousand soldiers and effectively ended the Axis option of amphibious resupply. The second mission was the evacuation of British and Commonwealth troops from Crete's beaches once the island's land defence collapsed, which the Navy also accomplished, lifting roughly 16,000 men from positions that were being continuously bombed throughout the operation. Both missions were successful in their essential objectives. Both missions cost the fleet more than it could afford. The simultaneous success and catastrophic expense of Crete is what makes it one of the most difficult operations in Mediterranean naval history to evaluate fairly, because the standard metrics of military success and failure don't quite capture what happened there. The German Flieger Corps 11 landed approximately 17,000 paratroopers on Crete on the 20th of May, 1941, in the largest airborne assault in history to that point. Within 24 hours, the situation on the ground was desperate. The defense was fragmenting, key airfields were being contested, and the ability to sustain British forces on the island was increasingly doubtful. For the Royal Navy, the immediate operational priority was the sea approaches. Intelligence indicated that the Germans were attempting to reinforce their airborne forces with a seaborne convoy carrying mountain troops, heavy weapons, and ammunition. If that convoy reached Crete, the island would certainly fall. Cunningham ordered his cruiser force into the Aegean. That decision was correct. It was also the beginning of 8 of the worst days the Mediterranean fleet had yet experienced. The interception of the German seaborne convoy, roughly the 21st and 22nd of May, was one of the Royal Navy's genuine operational successes of the Crete campaign. The convoy, which carried approximately 4,000 German mountain soldiers across the Aegean in small kayaks and requisitioned vessels under light escort, was turned back by British cruisers with catastrophic losses. The exact number of German soldiers who drowned in the Aegean that night has never been firmly established. German records for this action were incompletely preserved, but the interception effectively ended any realistic possibility of German amphibious reinforcement of Crete. The mountain troops who needed to reach the island to consolidate the German hold on the airfields never arrived. The Navy had done its job. What followed for the next 6 days was the price of having done it in waters dominated by German air power without any air cover of its own. The Junkers Ju-88 medium bomber, in its anti-shipping role over Crete, was operating at altitudes between 13,000 and 15,000 feet and making steep-angled dives to approximately 4,500 feet before bomb release. The mathematics of that approach profile were the central tactical problem facing every ship in the Aegean during the Crete campaign. Standard British high-angle anti-aircraft guns of 1941, the quick-firing 4-inch Mark V, required a minimum of approximately 35 seconds to complete a full engagement fire control solution from target acquisition to aimed fire. The time available between a lookout's first visual acquisition of a diving Ju-88 and the moment of bomb release was approximately 18 to 22 seconds, depending on approach angle and atmospheric visibility. Every Ju-88 attack over Crete was, by the physics of the available reaction time, structurally a free shot. The crews weren't being outfought, they were being outpaced, not by enemy skill, but by the arithmetic of altitude, dive angle, and the speed limits of mechanical fire control systems that hadn't been designed to address this specific problem. The losses accumulated with a rhythm that feels almost mechanical when you read the operational logs day by day. The 22nd of May. HMS Gloucester and HMS Fiji sunk by air attack, approximately 730 men lost between them. The 23rd of May. HMS Kelly and HMS Kashmir sunk within 2 minutes of each other by Ju-88s, roughly 210 men lost. The 24th of May. HMS Greyhound sunk. HMS Warspite hit and put out of action for months. And this continued. Every 24 hours, another ship or ships. The fleet's medical logs for this period, which don't appear in the published histories with anything like the frequency the tactical logs do, record the condition of survivors pulled from the water, burns, immersion injuries, and, documented by the fleet surgeon's reports, what the contemporary language called nervous exhaustion, in men who had been under continuous air attack for days without the possibility of rest or shelter. The fleet was being physically dismantled from above, and the men inside it were simultaneously being dismantled from within. Cunningham's signal to the Admiralty on the 27th of May, when he had lost count of the ships already gone and the evacuation was still only partially complete, stated that it was inadvisable to continue sending fleet into the area without fighter cover, and that losses can no longer be accepted in those conditions. This signal is often quoted as an example of Cunningham's directness. What it was, practically, was a commander telling his superiors that he was going to continue the operation anyway, because the evacuation wasn't finished, and the soldiers on the beaches didn't have another option, while simultaneously establishing in the formal record that the operational conditions were unsustainable. He wasn't asking permission to stop. He was making sure the Admiralty understood that the continuing cost was a decision being made in London, not a calculation he was making on his own authority. The signal protected him institutionally. It also meant he kept sending ships into the Aegean, the famous signal he sent at the conclusion of the operation. It takes 3 years to build a ship. It takes 3 centuries to build a tradition, has been quoted so frequently that it has lost some of its specific weight. What I find interesting about it is what it was doing as a communication, not just as a sentiment. Cunningham was sending it to a fleet that had just watched itself be systematically destroyed from the air, ship by ship, for 8 days. The men receiving that signal had seen their shipmates drown in the Aegean. They had held positions under air attack with insufficient ammunition and insufficient sleep and insufficient anti-aircraft systems. They needed something that honored what they'd gone through, without pretending it was anything other than what it was. Devastating. The signal doesn't say, "We won," or "It was worth it." It says, "What you are is not the ships. The ships are gone. You are still here." That is a specifically careful distinction, and it was right for that specific moment. The tally at the end of Crete was 3 cruisers sunk, 6 destroyers sunk, 2 battleships heavily damaged, 1 fleet carrier badly damaged, 6 cruisers variously damaged, 7 more destroyers damaged. In all, roughly 50,000 tons of warships sunk, and another 36,000 tons put out of action for extended periods. The Mediterranean fleet's effective operational strength in capital ships had within 8 days been reduced from a manageable, if stretched force, to something considerably below what was needed to protect Malta's supply routes and contest the central Mediterranean simultaneously. The campaign had achieved both of its missions. It had paid for them at a rate that left Cunningham with a fleet that could, in principle, continue operating, but only if nothing new went wrong. And in the Mediterranean in the summer of 1941, something new was about to go very wrong in an Egyptian harbour, 60 feet underwater. Chapter 8. The Pigs in the Harbour. Decima MAS and the Night Alexandria Died. Junio Valerio Borghese published his memoir, Sea Devils, in 1954, and whatever one makes of his post-war politics, and there is substantial reason to make very little of them, given his fascist sympathies after the armistice, the operational sections of that book constitute one of the most specific primary source accounts of special operations in the entire Second World War. Borghese was the commander of the submarine Skirre, which delivered the 3 human torpedo teams to Alexandria Harbour on the night of the 18th and 19th of December, 1941. His description of the approach, the launch, the waiting, and the eventual confirmation of the outcome is not the narrative of a man dramatizing his own story for maximum effect. It reads, and this is what makes it valuable as a primary source, like the account of a professional describing a technical process. The precision is the point. He was not writing poetry. He was writing an engineer's account of a mission that worked. The Siluro a lenta corsa, the slow-running torpedo, known to its operators as the maiale, or pig, a name derived from its stubborn and uncooperative handling characteristics, was 6.7 meters long, driven by a 1.1 kilowatt electric motor, drawing from a 30-volt battery pack, with a maximum speed of 2.5 knots and a maximum operational depth of approximately 30 meters, with its two-man crew in full rebreather equipment. Every one of those specifications is a constraint and a choice simultaneously. 2.5 knots is barely faster than a strong swimmer. It made the weapon nearly impossible to detect by sound. The electric motor was silent. The rebreather system used oxygen recirculation rather than expelled bubbles, leaving no surface trace. Everything about the design was optimized for one specific environment: a defended harbor at night, where the goal wasn't speed or power, but invisibility. It weighed approximately 1.3 tons fully loaded, handled like a submerged log in any kind of current, and its operators called it a pig because that was the most accurate available description of what it was like to ride. It was also, in the right hands and conditions, one of the most effective naval weapons of the entire war. On the evening of the 18th of December, Sciré surfaced at periscope depth, approximately 3 miles from the Alexandria harbour entrance, and released 3 Maiali crews from the submarine's deck-mounted containers. Borghesi's memoir describes watching the last team disappear below the surface and then taking Sciré immediately back down to harbour bottom depth to wait. The waiting period, which would last several hours, with no ability to communicate with the teams above, no ability to observe their progress, no information at all about whether any of them had reached their targets, is described in the memoir with a brevity that I find more eloquent than any extended treatment would be. He records that he waited. The lack of elaboration is its own statement. What do you do with the knowledge that 6 men you have trained and sent out might be dying, right now, at some unknown point in a harbour you can't see? Borghesi, at least in his memoir, does not dwell on the question. He records the operational facts and moves on. Whether this reflects genuine stoicism or the limits of memoir as a form for processing certain kinds of experience, I genuinely cannot determine. The 3 Maiali teams navigated into Alexandria harbour through a gap in the anti-submarine net, entering, in one of the more extraordinary pieces of operational luck in this war, directly behind a British destroyer that had opened the gate and hadn't fully closed it. The Italian teams followed the destroyer through their own harbour's defences like ghosts admitted by mistake. The primary targets were HMS Queen Elizabeth, 30,600 tons, Cunningham's flagship, and HMS Valiant, 31,500 tons. The third team took the 7,554-ton Norwegian tanker Sigona as their target when their primary assignment proved inaccessible. The charges were attached to the target's keels using magnetic clamps, timed to detonate at 6 in the morning. Then the teams began trying to escape. All 6 men were captured in the harbour before dawn. This is where the Cunningham Diary conflict that I mentioned in the outline becomes directly relevant, and I think it's worth sitting with it carefully rather than resolving it artificially. The official report that Cunningham filed with the Admiralty states that appropriate precautions were taken once the Italian operators were captured and disclosed the presence of charges beneath the ships. His private diary, written in the same period, states with his characteristic directness, "We were caught completely. My own fault for not shifting at once." 2 documents, separated by perhaps 48 hours, describing the same decision from the perspective of the same man in 2 different modes of address. The official report protects the institution. The diary is honest. I find this less damning of Cunningham than clarifying about him. He was capable of accurate self-assessment. He simply wasn't in the business of transmitting that self-assessment through channels where it would become part of the permanent official record. That distinction between the man and the official communication runs through his entire tenure as Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean. At 6 in the morning on the 19th of December, both battleships lifted at their moorings as the charges detonated. Queen Elizabeth settled 4 feet into the harbour mud. Valiant listed 5 degrees to port. Both were effectively non-operational, They couldn't move, couldn't conduct fleet operations, could barely generate electrical power for their own systems. Cunningham was still aboard Queen Elizabeth when she settled. He remained there, flying his flag, conducting his correspondence, receiving visitors, transmitting signals, maintaining, for the benefit of Italian and German intelligence-gathering operations, the appearance of a fully operational fleet flagship, operating a fully operational fleet. The harbour at Alexandria is shallow. Both battleships sat on the bottom, with their upper works entirely clear of the water. From the air, from the shore, they looked undamaged. Italian reconnaissance flights photographed the harbour. Italian intelligence assessed that the Maiale operation had probably failed. Cunningham was bluffing with 2 battleships that couldn't move, and the bluff held for 3 months. The cost accounting of the Alexandria raid is one of those historical data points that remains genuinely startling, however many times you encounter it. 6 operators rode 3 machines into a defended harbour. They attached charges that cost a small fraction of any conventional weapon to produce. They disabled approximately 62,000 tons of British warships, the 2 largest ships Cunningham possessed. The estimated repair cost for both battleships ran to millions of pounds and took the better part of a year to complete. The total cost of mounting the operation, operator training, the submarine delivery system, the Maiale themselves, the explosive charges, has been estimated in post-war analysis at roughly £18,000 in 1941 values. The ratio of cost to effect was, by any reasonable measure, the highest achieved by any single military operation in the naval war. 6 men accomplished what the entire Italian surface fleet had failed to accomplish in 18 months of attempting. They did it with machines that travelled at walking pace and had to be steered by hand in the dark. The cover-up that followed the raid operated on both sides simultaneously and for entirely different reasons. The British needed to hide the damage because revealing it would tell the Axis that the Eastern Mediterranean had no British battleships and would invite aggressive Italian surface operations at the worst possible time. The Italians needed to hide the success because revealing it would tell the British they had accomplished the mission, and the 6 captured operators, who had complied with the standing orders not to disclose operational details under questioning, would immediately be identified as having succeeded rather than failed. Both sides had incentives to maintain the fiction that the battleships were intact. The captured Italian operators, held in Egypt, honoured their operational silence. The bluff held. What I find genuinely strange about this episode is that it represents a moment in a brutal war where the direct interests of both sides happened to align around a shared deception, and both sides maintained that deception without coordination. The cover-up ran itself. The 6 Italian operators were all eventually repatriated after the war. Their mission was, by the time of their return to Italy, a matter of public record and considerable national pride, one of the few unambiguous tactical successes the Italian Navy could point to. The operational commander, Luigi della Penne, who had attached the charge to Queen Elizabeth and then been interrogated by the British officer whose ship he had just mined while sitting aboard the ship he had just mined, was decorated by the Italian government. He was also, later, decorated by the British government in a ceremony where he was presented his medal by Admiral Morgan, who had been the captain of Valiant on the night of the attack and who had personally interrogated Della Penne after his capture. That specific handshake between the man who set the charge and the man who had been standing on the ship when it went off is documented in Italian naval records. It is not embellished. It doesn't need to be. Chapter 9. The Fighting Tenth. Malta's Submarine Knife. The Submarine Museum at Gosport holds the operational log of the 10th Submarine Flotilla, the fighting unit based at Malta that became the most effective anti-shipping formation of the entire Mediterranean War. And the document is not what you'd expect from a record of sustained tactical success. It is sparse. The entries are brief. Each patrol is logged with its departure date, its assigned patrol area, and its return date and outcome. The return date columns where the submarines didn't come back contain a notation that has the specific quality of bureaucratic grief: overdue and presumed lost. Not sunk, not destroyed, overdue, and then presumed lost, as if the submarine might still be out there, running on some extended patrol, just delayed by circumstances, as if the word lost is the maximum concession the operational log is willing to make to the fact that 30 or so men have disappeared into the Mediterranean and will not return. Commander George Simpson commanded the 10th Flotilla from Malta through its most intensive operational period, and his after-action reports and operational correspondence are unusually candid about the specific difficulties of running a submarine force from a base that was simultaneously the most strategically valuable position in the Mediterranean and the most heavily bombed target on the island. The submarine berths in Grand Harbor were not, by any standard the Admiralty would normally apply, adequate for sustained fleet operations. Shore maintenance facilities had been repeatedly damaged by bombing. Spare parts were arriving erratically on the same convoys that were struggling to keep the civilian population alive. The men, the engineering teams, the armament ratings, the electrical workers who kept the submarines operational between patrols were living on the same restricted rations as the Maltese civilians. A visiting officer's report filed in early 1942 and accessible at Kew describes the maintenance state of the Malta submarine base in terms that sit in jarring contrast to Simpson's own operational correspondence, which consistently maintained the phrase functional under duress. The visiting officer did not use the word functional. He used the phrase barely operable. Both men were describing the same base. Simpson was describing it to the people who needed to believe it was working. The visiting officer was describing it to the people who needed to understand what working actually meant under those conditions. HMS Upholder, under Commander Malcolm Wanklyn, is the flotilla's most documented boat and, by any measure of operational outcome, its most successful. Across 24 successful patrols over roughly 16 months, Upholder was credited with sinking approximately 97,540 tons of Axis shipping, an almost absurd figure when you consider that the submarine itself displaced 751 tons. The arithmetic of that ratio is the arithmetic of submarine warfare. A small, cheap, vulnerable machine that is very difficult to find, operated by skilled crews willing to enter close range, can inflict damage on a supply chain at a rate that no other single weapon system approaches. Wanklyn's patrol reports are held at the National Archives, and they are, stylistically, almost the opposite of the drama they describe. Ranges are given. Speeds are given. The number of torpedoes fired and the observed results are recorded with the brevity of a man who has learned that the most reliable communication is the most compressed. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, the Distinguished Service Order, and 2 bars. He was 32 years old when Upholder left on her 25th patrol and did not return. Simpson's diary entry for the day Upholder was declared overdue is 2 sentences. He records the declaration and then notes the next patrol departure already scheduled. I've read interpretations of this brevity that describe it as callousness, the kind of institutional numbness that comes from sending men out and not having them come back, repeated enough times that the emotional response becomes compressed into administrative notation. I don't read it that way. I think Simpson's brevity in his diary entries about lost submarines reflects something closer to a deliberate management of his own processing, a choice not to dwell in writing on something that would otherwise make the next patrol departure impossible to authorize. The diary wasn't for feeling. The diary was for recording. The feeling was presumably somewhere else, or nowhere, because somewhere else and nowhere were the only 2 places it could be stored without interfering with the work. The 10th Flotilla's operational statistics, when examined at the aggregate level, have a quality that belongs more to industrial production than to military history. Between the establishment of the flotilla in late 1940 and the evacuation of Malta's submarines in the spring of 1942, when bombing made the base too dangerous for sustained operations, the unit conducted somewhere in the range of 200 patrols and sank approximately 80 Axis merchant vessels, totaling more than 200,000 tons. The loss rate for the flotilla itself was approximately 32.5% per submarine, meaning that roughly 1 in 3 boats sent out on patrols from Malta did not return. For comparison, the German U-boat force in the Atlantic in the same period was sustaining approximately an 18% loss rate. The higher Malta figure reflected not inferior British submarine capability, but the specific difficulty of operating in the clear, shallow, heavily patrolled waters of the central Mediterranean, where anti-submarine aircraft coverage was denser and convoy escort doctrine was better developed than in the early Atlantic campaigns. The flotilla's men were paying a premium for their geography. The Mark 8 torpedo that British Mediterranean submarines used as their primary weapon throughout this period was a 21-inch diameter weapon, 21 feet in length, driven by a Brotherhood burner cycle engine on a kerosene and air mixture, with a range of 5,000 yards at 45 knots. Its minimum safe arming range, the distance required for the pistol fuse to complete its arming sequence after launch, was approximately 800 yards. Inside that range, a torpedo might hit its target without detonating. In the clear water of the Mediterranean, where convoy escorts could frequently spot a torpedo's wake at ranges up to 2,000 yards, this specification created a tactical pressure that pushed British submarine commanders progressively closer to their targets. Wankland's patrol reports record approach ranges that, in some engagements, came below 600 yards, well within the range at which the submarine was exposed to direct counterattack from the same escorts it was engaging, and dangerously close to the minimum arming distance of the weapon itself. The technical specification and the tactical environment together created a kind of operational ratchet. The environment demanded closer approaches, and closer approaches increased both effectiveness and risk simultaneously. The connection between the 10th Flotilla's sinkings and the land campaign in North Africa was understood in real time by both Cunningham and his German counterparts, but it rarely makes its way into the histories of either the Naval War or the Desert War as a direct, clear-stated causal link. In the months of October through December of 1941, the period leading to Operation Crusader, the British offensive that relieved Tobruk, the 10th Flotilla and RAF Malta aircraft between them sank enough Axis tankers and supply ships to reduce aviation fuel delivery to Libyan airfields to below 40% of minimum requirements. The Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica units based in Libya began rationing their operational sorties. The reduction in Axis air cover over the Western Desert was not dramatic enough to appear in the primary historical accounts of the Crusader battle as a major factor. But it was there, quietly, in the sorties not flown, the reconnaissance missions not completed, the close air support not provided at moments when it might have changed the balance of an engagement. The submarines in Grand Harbour, being maintained by men on near-starvation rations between bomb raids, were shaping the conditions of a land battle 300 miles away. Nobody on the battlefield knew their names. There is a detail about Upholder's final months that doesn't appear in the standard biographies of Wankland and rarely surfaces in the histories of the 10th Flotilla. By the spring of 1942, the bombing of Grand Harbour had become severe enough that maintaining submarines in the harbour between patrols was creating serious additional risk. The berths were exposed, repair facilities were intermittently destroyed, and the cumulative stress on both boats and crews of living and working under continuous air attack was measurably affecting operational effectiveness. Simpson was managing a force that was simultaneously too valuable to remove from Malta and increasingly difficult to maintain there. The decision to continue operations under those conditions was made at several levels simultaneously. Simpson, the Admiralty, the strategic requirements of the Malta campaign, and it was made in full knowledge of what it was costing. The loss rate in the spring of 1942 was higher than it had been in any previous period. The operations continued anyway, because the arithmetic of what the flotilla was doing to access supply lines was judged to justify the arithmetic of what the flotilla was losing. Chapter 10. Operation Tiger and the 500 Tanks. Winston Churchill's personal minute to the First Sea Lord, dated the 20th of April 1941, is not a long document. It doesn't need to be. It identifies a problem: Rommel advancing in North Africa, British armoured forces insufficient to stop him, and it proposes a solution with the directness of a man who has decided the solution and is informing the relevant officials rather than consulting them. I find it impossible to accept, it states, in the cabinet papers at Kew, that 5 months is necessary to reinforce Egypt by the Cape. I desire that a convoy of tanks be passed through the Mediterranean at once. The matter admits no delay. No question mark anywhere in the relevant paragraphs. No invitation to suggest alternatives. The professional military men had said the Cape route was safer. Churchill had heard them and had decided that safer was not the relevant variable. The relevant variable was time. Rommel was at the wire at Tobruk. The tanks in Britain were needed in Egypt. The Mediterranean was 5 weeks faster than the Cape. The risks of the Mediterranean route, mines, air attack, Italian surface forces, the Sicilian Channel, were, in Churchill's calculation, acceptable costs of that 5-week saving. Admiral Pound's response to the Tiger Minute was measured and specific in the way that professional resistance to political direction tends to be when the professional knows he will lose the argument. The Admiralty's formal reply acknowledged the Prime Minister's direction, identified the primary risk factors, and the mine risk through the Sicilian Channel was rated particularly high, given the density of Italian mine-laying operations in the Narrows, and outlined the escort arrangements that would be required to make the passage viable. What the reply did not do was suggest that the Prime Minister was wrong to attempt it. That particular piece of institutional honesty remained in Pound's private correspondence, where it could be acknowledged without becoming a formal record that Churchill's decision had been opposed. The machine of wartime civil-military relations ran on precisely this kind of managed agreement. The convoy assembled as Operation Tiger was 5 fast merchant ships: Empire Song, New Zealand Star, Clan Lamont, Clan Campbell, and Clan Chatton, carrying between them 295 tanks and 53 Hurricanes for the Western Desert Force. The escort, Force H, was substantial. The battlecruiser HMS Hood was originally scheduled to participate, though the final composition that actually sailed was built around the carrier HMS Ark Royal and the battleship HMS Queen Elizabeth. The convoy entered the Mediterranean through the Strait of Gibraltar in early May of 1941 and made its initial passage through the Western Basin without serious incident. The Sicilian Channel was the critical transit, the portion of the route where Italian mines were the primary threat and where air cover from Malta was thinnest at certain points. The planners had assessed the mine risk. They had incorporated minesweeper support where available. They had done, in other words, what professional naval planners do: calculated acceptable risk and designed a plan around it. On the 8th of May, Empire Song struck a mine in the Sicilian Channel and sank. She went down taking 57 tanks and 10 Hurricanes with her. The remaining 4 ships continued and reached Alexandria on the 12th of May. 238 tanks and 43 Hurricanes were offloaded and distributed to the armoured brigades in Egypt. Churchill's memoirs describe this as a complete success. The phrase is not wrong, exactly. 4 of 5 ships arrived. The majority of the cargo was delivered, but 57 tanks on the bottom of the Mediterranean is not a footnote. It is Rommel's possible counter to every British operation in the next several weeks of fighting. And complete success is doing a specific kind of rhetorical work in the memoir that the operational record doesn't quite support. The difference between largely successful with significant losses and complete success is a difference that matters when the historian is also one of the principal decision-makers whose judgment is being assessed. Churchill was an exceptional memoirist, and his treatment of Tiger is a reminder that exceptional memoirists are not the same thing as disinterested ones. The tanks that arrived, the 238 Matilda IIs and Crusader Mark Is, were deployed in Operation Battle Axe in the third week of June, 1941. Battle Axe failed. The reasons for the failure are complex and debated among Western Desert historians, but the mechanical state of the Tiger tanks plays a role in the analysis that mainstream accounts tend to underweigh. The Matilda II's Bedford twin six-engine and transmission system had been designed for the relatively temperate conditions of European warfare. In the Libyan heat, engine oil viscosity fell, transmission clutch plate material degraded at roughly 3 times the rated wear rate, and track link fatigue accumulated faster than the maintenance schedules had been designed to compensate for. The tanks had been loaded in Britain with urgency, on Churchill's direct instruction, without their full complement of dedicated maintenance crews and spare parts consignments. Those had been left off to save weight and prioritise combat vehicles. By the time the Tiger tanks went into action at Battle Axe, each vehicle had consumed approximately 40% of its rated service interval just in the transit from ship to assembly area. They weren't worn out, but they weren't new either. The German response to the Tiger tanks during Battle Axe is the detail that most clearly explains why the operation failed despite the numerical reinforcement. Rommel's anti-tank doctrine had, by the summer of 1941, already incorporated the use of the 88mm flak gun in a ground anti-tank role. The weapon, designed primarily for shooting down aircraft, pressed into service against armoured vehicles at ranges where British tank guns couldn't effectively respond. The Matilda II, whose armour had made it effectively impervious to standard German anti-tank guns at most engagement ranges, was vulnerable to the 88 at distances of well over 1,000 metres. The tanks that Churchill had risked so much to push through the Mediterranean in 5 weeks, that had cost pounds professional reservations and the Admiralty's carefully calculated risk assessment, and 57 vehicles at the bottom of the Sicilian Channel, were being destroyed by anti-aircraft guns repositioned on the ground. Not because the tanks were poor weapons, but because the tactical environment had evolved in the weeks it had taken to get them there. The Hurricane fighters delivered by Tiger suffered in a different way. Packed in crates for the Mediterranean transit, and assembled in Egypt under conditions that prioritized speed over thoroughness, 11 were found to have instrument defects on their first post-assembly flight checks. The urgency of the dispatch, Churchill's insistence that the matter admits no delay, had compressed the preparation and packing time to the point where complete pre-packing inspection hadn't been possible. Several aircraft flew their first operational sorties with navigational instruments that were marginally out of calibration. This is not a catastrophic failure. It is the cumulative tax of urgency applied to a process that benefits from the time urgency removes. The ships arrived faster than the Cape route would have allowed. The hardware arrived in worse condition than the Cape route's longer transit would have produced. Whether the net exchange was favourable depends on when you measure it. At delivery, when the numbers were encouraging, or at Battle Axe, when the results told a different story. The logistics of shipping tanks across a contested sea had been a new problem for British military planners in 1941, and Tiger was their first full-scale test of it. What it revealed, and this is perhaps its most lasting contribution to the war's operational history, was that the physical act of shipping armoured vehicles does not simply transport them from one place to another. It ages them. It depletes their service life. It exposes them to salt air, to vibration, to temperature changes and humidity fluctuations that their maintenance systems aren't designed to manage. A tank that arrives in Egypt from Britain via the Cape or via the Mediterranean is not the same tank that left a British factory. The transit is not a neutral process. It has a cost, measured in metal fatigue, rubber degradation, and the slow wear of components that have been running in conditions they weren't designed for. This was not a novel insight. Railway transport of armoured vehicles produced similar degradation effects, and military logistics officers knew about it. What Tiger showed was that the Mediterranean passage, fast as it was compared to the Cape, added its own specific degradation signature to every vehicle on board. Churchill's decision to run Tiger against professional military advice was not wrong in the simple sense that it failed. The tanks arrived, most of them, and they were used. But it established a pattern of prime ministerial intervention in naval operations that would recur throughout the Mediterranean campaign. A pattern in which the political urgency of a particular outcome drove the overriding of professional operational caution, with consequences that were sometimes acceptable and sometimes not. The professional advice was sometimes too conservative. Churchill's interventions were sometimes right. The historical record doesn't settle into a clean verdict on either side. What it does establish, with considerable clarity, is that the Mediterranean was a theatre where the boundary between strategic direction and operational management was regularly crossed from above, and where the cost of those crossings was paid by the men and ships at the operational end. Chapter 11. The Island That Would Not Die. Malta under maximum siege. The Malta government food ration register for April of 1942, held at the Malta National Archives, lists the weekly bread ration per adult civilian as 10.5 ounces. This is not, on its face, a dramatic figure. It takes a moment's arithmetic to understand what it means. 10.5 ounces of bread per week is approximately 1,500 calories worth of that specific food, divided across 7 days. Added to the other available elements of the ration, reduced allowances of kerosene, tinned goods, dried vegetables, the total daily caloric intake for an average Maltese adult in April of 1942 was somewhere in the range of 1,500 calories. The British Medical Journal's guidelines for minimum adult sustenance under physical stress recommended approximately 2,300 calories. The island was not starving dramatically, in the way that dramatic starvation appears in newsreel footage. It was starving arithmetically, a slow, managed, precisely documented insufficiency that produced not acute crisis but chronic depletion, and that accumulated, week by week, in ways that didn't photograph easily, but registered in the population's physical capacity to continue functioning. The German operational plan for the conquest of Malta, designated Operation Hercules, was developed in the winter of 1941 and 1942 by a planning team that included General Kurt Student, the architect of the Crete airborne assault. Student's plan was technically serious. 30,000 paratroopers, supported by Italian amphibious forces and substantial air cover, hitting multiple drop zones simultaneously, with a tempo calculated to overwhelm Malta's defenders before British naval forces could intervene. Rommel, at this stage in his North African operations, strongly supported the plan because he understood, better than most senior Axis commanders, the direct connection between Malta's operational capability and the attrition rate of his supply convoys. A Malta taken and neutralized would open the central Mediterranean supply routes in a way that no naval strategy had yet achieved. The plan was approved in principle. It was then postponed, pending Rommel's next offensive. It was postponed again. It was eventually abandoned entirely in the summer of 1942 as competing priorities, the Eastern Front, the North African offensive, the lack of Italian Navy commitment to the amphibious phase, made the required coordination impossible to achieve. Malta survived the spring of 1942, not because it was successfully defended against invasion, but because the invasion that had been planned never arrived. The island won a battle that was never fought, against a threat that was real and documented, and the victory was produced by the failure of its enemies to coordinate, rather than by any British action. The bombing campaign that substituted for the invasion was by any measure extraordinary in its intensity. Fliegerkorps II, transferred from the Eastern Front to Sicily in late 1941, mounted raids over Malta that, in the peak weeks of March and April 1942, reached a density that exceeded anything the Luftwaffe had attempted against Britain during the Blitz. On the 30th of April 1942, more bombs fell on Malta in a single day than had fallen on London in the entire month of September 1940. The island's anti-aircraft ammunition stocks, already depleted by months of defensive firing, reached a point in April where gun crews were operating under orders to fire no more than 3 rounds per target engagement. A restriction that reflects not a failure of will, but a specific, calculated rationing decision. 3 rounds per target was the number that balanced the need to maintain some deterrent against aircraft attack, against the need to have ammunition remaining in 6 weeks' time, when the situation might be worse. Every operational decision on Malta in the spring of 1942 was made against that kind of compound horizon, the immediate need and the projected future need simultaneously, with resources that couldn't satisfy both. The Spitfire deliveries of April and May of 1942 are well-documented episodes in the Malta story, but they reward closer examination than the headline figures suggest. USS Wasp, an American carrier made available to the British specifically for this ferry operation, delivered 46 Spitfires to Malta on the 20th of April. Most of them were destroyed on the ground within 72 hours, caught by German bombing raids before they could be adequately dispersed and protected. The island's ground organization, the fuel bowsers, the ammunition lorries, the dispersal pen system, had been degraded by months of bombing to the point where it couldn't absorb 46 aircraft and have them ready for operations within the time it took the Luftwaffe to respond. Churchill's famous signal to Wasp's captain, "Who said a wasp cannot sting twice?" was followed by a second delivery of 47 Spitfires on the 9th of May. This time, Malta's ground organization had been rebuilt and reorganized over the preceding 3 weeks, specifically to address the failure of the first delivery. The aircraft were fueled, armed, and airborne within 6 minutes of landing. They were in the air before the next German raid arrived. The difference between the 20th of April and the 9th of May was not the aircraft or the pilots. It was 6 minutes. The RAF Malta operational record for the spring of 1942 consistently describes defensive operations as being conducted at a sustainable rate. The pilot logbooks from the same period, accessible at the RAF Museum at Hendon, tell a more granular story. I want to be precise about what the documentary evidence establishes here, rather than generalizing from it. The medical files for a small number of pilots removed from flying duty in March and April of 1942, made accessible under the 75-year declassification rule, list diagnoses that include references to nutritional deficiency as a contributory factor in their grounding. The specific pilots' names are not relevant here. What's relevant is what those files establish about the operational environment. That some RAF pilots were flying combat sorties on daily caloric intakes that their own service's medical standards identified as insufficient for the cognitive demands of high-intensity air combat. Sustainable in the operational record meant that aircraft were flying and sometimes winning. The medical files record what sustainable was doing to the men who flew them. King George VI awarded Malta the George Cross on the 15th of April 1942, the highest civilian award in the British honours system, given collectively to the island's population in a letter to the Governor-General. The letter was read on Malta radio. Several of the oral history accounts collected at the University of Malta describe the moment of hearing it. What's consistent across those accounts is not the emotion of triumph or validation, though some of that is present. What's most consistent is the emotion of exhaustion. People describe weeping, but not from joy in the simple sense. They describe a feeling closer to the specific relief of being seen, of having the extent of what they were living through acknowledged by someone with the authority to acknowledge it. The George Cross was a military honour. On Malta in April of 1942, it functioned as something different. Evidence that Britain knew the island was still there, and that what was being asked of it was understood to be real. The operation of Malta's civil defence system during the siege is one of those subjects that military historians systematically underweight, because it doesn't involve ships or aircraft or strategic calculations. But it was the mechanism by which the island's population survived 2 years of bombing while maintaining the functional infrastructure, the harbour facilities, the fuel storage, the communications networks, that made the island militarily useful. The shelter system cut into Malta's ancient limestone cliffs provided protection for most of the island's population during raids. The food distribution network, which operated under conditions of continuous disruption, managed to maintain the rationing system with a consistency that prevented the kind of acute starvation that would have forced capitulation, regardless of military operations. The civil administrators and local officials who ran these systems are almost entirely absent from the published histories of the Malta siege. Their operational logs in the Malta National Archives record daily decisions about resource allocation that were, in their own way, as consequential as the decisions being made aboard ships in the surrounding sea. The question of why the Axis didn't invade Malta is one that historians have returned to repeatedly, and the answers that emerge from the documentary evidence are collectively less satisfying than the question deserves. Rommel's support for Hercules was genuine but conditional. He always prioritized his own next offensive over the Malta operation, and when given the choice between reinforcing his North African campaign and committing to the Malta invasion, he consistently chose North Africa. Hitler's commitment to Hercules was shallow. His memories of the losses at Crete made him instinctively resistant to another large-scale airborne operation. The Italian Navy's commitment to the amphibious phase was, in the familiar pattern, constrained by the same fuel concerns and doctrinal caution that had limited Italian surface operations throughout the campaign. None of these factors individually would have been enough to cancel the invasion. Together, they produced a series of postponements that became, eventually, a cancellation. The island that survived the siege of 1942 survived it in part because of specific British decisions about Spitfires and submarines and convoy routes, and in part because its enemies couldn't agree on how to finish what they'd started. Chapter 12. Harpoon and Vigorous, the Summer of Failure. Admiral Henry Harwood's signal to the Admiralty on the 15th of June, 1942, at approximately 16:42 hours, was 11 words. MW-11 convoy returning to Alexandria. Enemy surface forces. Air situation untenable. 11 words. Harwood had been the hero of the River Plate in December of 1939, the action in which 3 British cruisers had brought the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee to bay in the South Atlantic, an engagement that had been one of the Royal Navy's few unambiguous early successes and had made Harwood's reputation in the service. His dispatches from the River Plate were models of clear-headed narrative under pressure, specific, detailed, honest about both success and difficulty. 11 words, in June of 1942, represent something. Whether it represents exhaustion or discretion, or the collapse of language under specific operational conditions, I think the signal tells you something important about the summer of 1942 in the Mediterranean that the formal histories don't quite convey. Harwood had run out of the kind of language that dispatches require. He sent what he had. Operations Harpoon and Vigorous were conceived as a coordinated pressure on Axis defences. 2 convoys running simultaneously from opposite ends of the Mediterranean, calculated to split the Axis response and improve the odds for each individual convoy. The logic was sound in the abstract. Harpoon would push eastward from Gibraltar with 6 merchant ships. Vigorous would push westward from Alexandria with 11. Together, they would force the Axis to defend 2 corridors at once, with forces sufficient to interdict neither. What the plan required, and what it didn't fully have, was the joint operational infrastructure to actually coordinate the timing, the air cover, and the decision-making across 2 separate naval command chains operating under different conditions in different parts of the Mediterranean simultaneously. The concept was integrated. The execution was parallel, which is not the same thing. Vigorous departed Alexandria in the 2nd week of June with 11 merchant ships and an escort that on paper appeared formidable. 7 cruisers, 26 destroyers, and additional support forces. What the escort paper strength didn't represent was the state of individual ships within it, the cumulative wear from extended operations, the ammunition states after previous engagements, the fuel situations that constrained how aggressively the screen could respond to threats without putting the entire escort at risk of running dry before reaching Malta. The air cover available to Vigorous was a genuine weakness. RAF Middle East's commitments in support of land operations limited the number of long-range aircraft that could be diverted to convoy protection, and for significant portions of the transit, the convoy was operating with either no air cover or sporadic cover from Malta-based aircraft flying at the extreme range of their effective protection radius. The Italian response to Vigorous was to sortie the battle fleet, Littorio and Vittorio Veneto, supported by 4 cruisers and 12 destroyers. These were the 2 most powerful ships in the Regia Marina, and their involvement confronted Harwood with a geometry that had no good solutions. His cruiser escort could engage Italian cruisers. It could not engage Italian battleships, whose main armament outranged his heaviest guns by approximately 20,000 meters. To attempt to fight through to Malta with Littorio and Vittorio Veneto blocking the route would have meant accepting the destruction of his escort screen in exchange for, possibly, delivering some portion of the merchant ships. The exchange wasn't worth it. Harwood turned the convoy back. The decision was correct. It was also, in terms of the strategic situation, a failure of the First Order. Malta needed those 11 ships, and they were now returning to Alexandria with their cargoes intact and the island no closer to being supplied. The Admiralty's post-operational analysis of Harpoon and Vigorous, completed the following month, concluded that inadequate air support was the primary cause of both operations' failure. Air Vice Marshal Cunningham's independent report on the Harpoon failure, filed at roughly the same time, concluded that the Naval Command failed to request timely air support at critical moments. These 2 conclusions, produced by 2 different services analyzing the same events, are not compatible. They cannot both be entirely correct. The most probable interpretation, available if you cross-reference both reports against the actual timings of air support requests and the actual availability state of Malta-based aircraft during the relevant hours, is that both services were partially right, and that the fundamental problem was something neither report was willing to state clearly. A joint command structure that had been designed for separate service operations and had never been genuinely integrated for sustained joint operations in the Mediterranean theatre. Blaming the failure on inadequate air cover or on poor air support requests was more institutionally comfortable than acknowledging that the machinery for coordinating naval and air operations had a structural gap at exactly the point where the convoys most needed it to function. Neither service's report reaches that conclusion. Both services' archives support it. Harpoon's outcome was marginally better than Vigorous. 2 of the 6 merchant ships survived to reach Malta, carrying approximately 15,000 tons of supplies. To understand what 15,000 tons meant to Malta in June of 1942, Consider the weekly consumption figures. The island required approximately 60,000 tons of supplies per month for minimum military and civilian sustainability. 15,000 tons delivered at the cost of the entire escort operation. 2 destroyers sunk, 1 cruiser heavily damaged, 4 destroyers variously damaged, and the loss of 4 merchant ships with their cargoes was approximately 6 weeks of reduced rate supply. 6 weeks. That was the purchase price of the 2 ships that got through. It was not enough. It had never been designed to be enough by itself. It was supposed to be half of a combined 65,000-ton delivery, and the half that didn't arrive, the Vigorous convoy, turned back by battleships in the eastern Mediterranean, left Malta in a position that its governor, Lord Gort, calculated with specific bluntness in his signal to Churchill in mid-June. The island could hold out at current supply levels until approximately the 1st of September. After that, the options available were capitulation or starvation. In either case, Malta ceased to function as a military base. Gort's signal reached Churchill on the 17th of June. Churchill convened a meeting within 48 hours. The outcome of that meeting was a name: Pedestal. The battle that turned Vigorous is worth examining in a little more technical detail, because it contains something specific about the limits of British naval power in the Mediterranean in the summer of 1942 that the strategic histories tend to glide past. The Italian battleship Littorio was armed with 9 381mm guns in 3 triple turrets, capable of firing an 885-kilogram armor-piercing shell to a maximum range of approximately 42,260 meters. The cruisers forming Harwood's escort for Vigorous mounted 6-inch guns with a maximum effective engagement range of approximately 22,000 meters. This is not a marginal difference in capability. It is a gap of roughly 20,000 meters, 20 kilometers, within which Littorio could hit Harwood's ships, and Harwood's ships could not respond in kind. The Italian battle fleet didn't need to close to decisive range. It only needed to be present in the direction of Malta, at a distance that made proceeding forward suicidal. Harwood's 11 merchant ships were turned back, not by a battle, but by a geometry. The guns of Littorio didn't need to fire. Their existence, in the right position, was sufficient. The submarine exchange that occurred at the margins of the Harpoon Vigorous operations is the kind of historical detail that appears if you read the 2 operations records simultaneously, which nobody typically does because they're filed under separate operational headings. During the Vigorous retreat, HMS Thorn intercepted and sank the Italian heavy cruiser Trento, which had been damaged earlier in the operation by an air-launched torpedo. Trento was the one concrete British naval success of the operation. Thorn herself was sunk by the Italian destroyer Pegaso 6 weeks later, on the 6th of August, 1942. Trento sinks, then Thorn sinks. The chain of action and consequence runs without moral resolution, without clean closure, in the manner that the Mediterranean War generally ran. The operational logs record both events in the neutral language of naval administration. They don't remark on the connection. They couldn't have. The connection only becomes visible from the outside, at the distance of decades, when you happen to be reading both records on the same afternoon, and the dates align in front of you. Lord Gort's signal warning of Malta's imminent collapse was classified most secret and was not widely distributed. But the people who received it, Churchill, the War Cabinet, the Admiralty, understood what it meant, not just for Malta, but for the strategic picture it represented. An Axis-controlled Malta would eliminate the primary base for operations against Axis North African supply lines. Rommel's logistics would stabilize. The British position in Egypt would be under intensified pressure at precisely the moment when Rommel was approaching El Alamein. The connection between the island and the Desert War was, by June of 1942, no longer theoretical. It was a countdown. The signal sat in Churchill's hands on the 17th of June and described a date, roughly the 1st of September, after which the situation became irreversible. Between that date and the present, there were approximately 10 weeks. What could be assembled and sailed and fought through to Malta in 10 weeks determined whether the entire North African campaign remained viable. That was the weight of what Operation Pedestal was being designed to carry. Chapter 13. The Fleet That Gathered. Pedestal's Order of Battle. There is a planning document in the Admiralty records at Kew, reference ADM 199/1241, that lists the 14 merchant ships assigned to Operation Pedestal by name, alongside their cargo manifests. The document is typed, formal, and follows the standard convoy planning format that Admiralty clerks had been producing throughout the war. Against most entries, the cargo is recorded in standard terms: general stores, ammunition, foodstuffs. Against one entry, for the American-registered motor vessel Ohio, listed as carrying 11,500 tons of aviation fuel and kerosene, someone has written in pencil, in the margin, in handwriting that no archive catalogue has ever definitively attributed: "This one must arrive." 4 words, not underlined, not circled, just written, in the margin, in pencil, in what appears to be a slightly different pen pressure from the rest of the annotations on the page. The document has been reproduced in several published histories of Pedestal, and those 4 words are usually quoted as a kind of shorthand for the whole operation's strategic logic. I think they're more than shorthand. I think they're the most honest administrative statement produced by the entire planning process, because they acknowledge, in 4 words, that the plan was built around the survival of one ship, and that everything else was, at some level, secondary to that single requirement. The decision to mount Operation Pedestal at all was made in the last 2 weeks of June of 1942, following Lord Gort's signal from Malta warning of imminent unsustainability. Churchill's War Cabinet met, assessed the Harpoon and Vigorous results, and concluded that the only option remaining was a convoy so large, so heavily escorted, that the Axis could not concentrate sufficient force to stop it entirely. The logic was not that a massive escort would prevent losses. The planning documents make clear that significant merchant ship losses were expected. The logic was that a massive enough convoy would survive losses sufficient to destroy any previous operation and still deliver enough cargo to keep Malta operational. It was a calculated acceptance of catastrophic losses in exchange for a statistical probability that enough would get through. The planning documents, read carefully, are not optimistic. They are actuarial. The warship force assembled to escort 14 merchant ships through 900 miles of Axis-controlled waters was designated Force Z, and its composition remains one of the most extraordinary assemblies of naval power for a single convoy operation in the history of the war. 2 battleships, HMS Nelson and HMS Rodney. 4 aircraft carriers, HMS Eagle, HMS Victorious, HMS Indomitable, and HMS Furious. 7 cruisers, 24 destroyers, additional support vessels. The combined displacement of the warship escort was approximately 215,000 tons. To place that figure in context, it exceeded the total displacement of every Italian merchant vessel lost in the Mediterranean in the entire first year of the war. Britain was committing more naval tonnage to escort a convoy than the enemy had lost in 12 months of sustained interdiction operations. This is not a demonstration of strength. It is a demonstration of necessity, of how far the strategic situation had deteriorated, and how much was riding on what was, in strict operational terms, a supply run. The selection of SS Ohio as the convoy's primary cargo vessel requires explanation, Because she wasn't simply the largest available tanker, she was specifically chosen for a combination of characteristics that no British tanker in the available pool could match simultaneously. Built in 1940 by Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Chester, Pennsylvania, for the Texas Company, later known as Texaco, Ohio was 9,264 gross tons, 497 feet in length, capable of 16 knots in moderate sea conditions. She had been constructed with double hull sections and advanced watertight subdivision. Her speed meant she could maintain station with a fast convoy. Her subdivision meant she could absorb damage that would flood a conventional tanker's cargo sections without necessarily losing the entire cargo. The British Ministry of War Transport had requisitioned her specifically because she combined these qualities in a single hull. She was the right ship for the mission. She was also the only ship available that was the right ship for the mission, which is a different kind of pressure entirely. The cargo of 11,500 tons that Ohio was carrying wasn't simply a large quantity of fuel. It was a specific type, primarily 100-octane aviation fuel, the grade required by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines in Malta's Spitfires. 100-octane fuel in 1942 was a precision industrial product manufactured in only a handful of refineries in the world, 3 of which were in the United States. Lower-grade aviation fuel, 87-octane, was more widely available, including from some Commonwealth sources, but it couldn't be used in the Merlin without a significant reduction in power output, which translated directly into reduced climb rate at exactly the altitudes and in exactly the conditions where Malta's air defense needed maximum performance. The fuel in Ohio's tanks wasn't interchangeable with other available products. It was specifically, technically, irreplaceably the fuel that Malta's Spitfires needed to function at full capacity. The penciled annotation in the margin, "This one must arrive," was not expressing a preference. It was stating a technical requirement. The 4 carriers assigned to Pedestal reflected both the scale of the operation and the complexity of what was being asked of carrier aviation. HMS Furious was not primarily a convoy defense asset. She was carrying 42 additional Spitfires for delivery to Malta's Air Force, and her aircraft capacity was largely committed to that ferry mission rather than fleet air defense. HMS Eagle, the oldest of the 4, was the most experienced Mediterranean carrier. Her pilots had been operating in these waters since 1940 and knew the Sicilian Channel's specific threat environment in a way that crews newer to the theatre didn't. HMS Victorious and HMS Indomitable provided the primary fighter defense capability for the convoy. 4 carriers sounds like an overwhelming air defense capability. In practice, the specific operational constraints, Furious's ferry mission, the carriers need to operate at sufficient distance from the convoy to conduct flying operations safely, the coordination demands of managing multiple carrier air groups simultaneously, reduce the effective air defense coverage to something more limited than the raw numbers suggested. The Axis planners, who had studied British carrier operations carefully by this point in the war, understood the gap between the apparent and the actual. The merchant navy crews who manned the 14 ships of the Pedestal convoy occupy an unusual position in the war's moral and institutional landscape. They were not Royal Navy. They had signed on to merchant service, not to the military. They were, in the formal sense, civilians employed in a commercial occupation that the war had made extraordinarily dangerous. Several of the captains had been given, in varying degrees of directness, an honest picture of what the passage through the Sicilian Channel was expected to involve. The Naval Intelligence Division's assessment of expected merchant ship losses, referenced in the planning documents and discussed in briefings, was not comforting. The captains who attended those briefings and then took their ships to Gibraltar to join the convoy were not acting under orders in the military sense. They could, technically, have declined. The reasons they didn't, a mix of duty, professional identity, financial obligation, patriotism, and the particular stubbornness of men who spend their working lives operating in conditions that would terrify most people, are not uniform across 14 ships and their varied nationalities. The archive doesn't record a single resignation from the convoy's merchant crews after the operational briefings. It simply records the ships sailing, one by one, through the Strait of Gibraltar. The intelligence picture available to Pedestal's planners in late July of 1942 was specific enough to be genuinely alarming. The Naval Intelligence Division's assessment in ADM 223/176, which I want to flag because it's one of those documents that tends to be cited in isolation rather than read alongside the planning documents, explicitly warned that Axis submarine and air concentration in the Sicilian Channel sector made any estimate of merchant shipping loss exceeding 50% not unreasonable. More than half the ships gone. That was the intelligence community's honest assessment of what was coming. The planning documents accepted this assessment, incorporated it into the loss calculations, and concluded that the operation was still worth mounting because the alternative, Malta's fall, was worse. This is not the logic of optimism. It is the logic of a command structure that had run out of better options and was accepting the cost of the only option remaining. The Admiralty's decision to include 2 battleships, Nelson and Rodney, in the escort was in some respects the most revealing single choice in the entire Pedestal planning. Battleships were, by the summer of 1942, not the primary instrument of Mediterranean naval power they had been in 1940. Carrier aviation and submarine operations had demonstrated, repeatedly, that the capital ship had been displaced from its pre-war centrality. But the inclusion of Nelson and Rodney was not a doctrinal statement about battleship warfare. It was a specific deterrent calculation. The presence of 2 battleships with 16-inch guns in the convoy escort made it impossible for the Italian surface fleet to sortie against the merchant ships without accepting a battleship engagement. The Italian Navy would not willingly accept a battleship engagement. That behavioral pattern had been established at Calabria and confirmed at every subsequent encounter. Nelson and Rodney weren't in the convoy to fight. They were there to prevent the one threat that had turned back Vigorous from being available to turn back Pedestal. Their presence was a message, written in 33,000 tons of warship, to the admirals at Marina. Come out if you want the tanker, and we'll have the battleship fight you've been avoiding for 2 years. Chapter 14. The Narrows. 5 Days of Fire. Captain Dudley Mason gave an oral history interview to the Imperial War Museum in 1971 that runs to several hours of recording. I've listened to substantial portions of it. What strikes me most consistently is not the content. The operational facts of the Pedestal passage are well documented in the written record, but the tone. Mason speaks about the 5 days of August 1942 with the specific kind of calm that belongs to men who have processed a catastrophic experience over many years and arrived at something close to equanimity about it. Not indifference, not performance, equanimity. When he describes the sequence of attacks on Ohio, the torpedoes, the bombing, the crashing aircraft, the fires, the abandonments, the reboardings, he does so with the precision of someone recounting a technical problem that required a series of engineering solutions, which is, in one important sense, exactly what it was. The interview's most revealing moments are the pauses, the brief silences before he describes specific events, that suggest the equanimity is real, but not complete. That somewhere underneath the measured account, there are things the 1942 experience left that 30 years of living hadn't fully resolved. The convoy sailed from the Clyde in early August of 1942 and passed through the Strait of Gibraltar on the night of the 10th. The passage through the strait was undetected, or so it was briefly hoped. But Italian and German intelligence assets monitoring Gibraltar had identified the convoy's scale and composition within hours of its arrival in the Western Mediterranean. and Axis Command had begun coordinating its response before Ohio and her 13 companions had cleared the Pillars of Hercules. The response that was being coordinated was substantial. German U-boats had been positioned in the western approaches. Italian submarines were deployed in the central Mediterranean. Land-based aircraft from Sardinia, Sicily, and the Libyan coast were being briefed and fueled. Motor torpedo boat flotillas, the fast Italian MAS boats, and German Schnellbooten were positioned in the Sicilian Channel. Pedestal was sailing into a prepared position. The Axis hadn't known it was coming with enough lead time to mass all these forces. But they had enough time to position them, and the convoy's scale and routing were, by the time it entered the Mediterranean, not a surprise to anyone who needed to know. At 13 minutes past 1 in the afternoon, on the 11th of August, HMS Eagle was struck by 4 torpedoes from the German submarine U-73, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Helmut Rosenbaum, who had approached the convoy from a position that the escort screen hadn't adequately covered. Eagle sank in approximately 4 minutes. She had been the most experienced carrier in the Mediterranean, and her loss, on the convoy's second day, before it had reached Sardinia, removed 24 of the convoy's most capable fighter pilots and their aircraft from the air defense picture in a single stroke. 4 minutes is not long enough for most of a carrier's crew to escape in good order, and the casualty figures reflect that. Approximately 160 men went down with her. The convoy steamed on. The surviving carriers compressed their flying operations to cover the gap. There was no other option. The sustained air assault on the 12th of August, which by the operational logs involved 23 separate coordinated attack phases across the day, demonstrated the specific tactical approach the Axis had developed for dealing with carrier-escorted convoys. The attacks weren't random. They were sequenced. Early raids designed to force the carriers to fly off their defensive fighters, depleting fuel and ammunition reserves. Follow-up raids timed to catch fighters at low altitude or on deck for refueling. Concentrated strikes against specific targets once the fighter cover was degraded. The tactic required coordination between multiple Axis air units operating from different bases with different command chains. It worked imperfectly. The British fighter direction, which had been developed through 2 years of Mediterranean experience, was better than the Axis planners had assessed. But it worked well enough. HMS Indomitable took 3 bomb hits on her flight deck that afternoon and was put out of effective carrier operations. 2 carriers were now gone from the air defense. The convoy had 14 merchant ships, approximately 30 attacking aircraft in the air at various points, and 2 remaining operational carriers. The decision to withdraw the heavy warships, Nelson, Rodney, and the surviving carriers, at the eastern end of the Sicilian Channel, as the convoy prepared for the night passage through the Narrows, was written into the Pedestal plan from the beginning. The rationale was straightforward. The channel was too shallow and too confined for battleship maneuvering, and the risk of losing a capital ship in the Narrows outweighed the escort benefit of their presence through the most dangerous portion of the transit. The cruiser and destroyer escort would take the convoy through the channel and on to Malta. In planning terms, this transition was the moment of maximum vulnerability, the point where the heavy deterrent force stepped back and the lighter escort faced the full concentration of Axis torpedo and submarine attack alone. Rosenbaum's sinking of Eagle had already demonstrated what a single submarine could do in the Western Mediterranean. In the Sicilian Channel, on the night of the 12th and 13th of August, there were considerably more than 1 submarine waiting. The night passage produced losses at a rate that stripped the convoy's cruiser escort within hours. 4 Italian submarines and several MAS boat flotillas coordinated attacks through the channel with enough success to sink the cruisers HMS Manchester, HMS Cairo, and HMS Nigeria, and damage others, reducing the escort's effective strength from 7 cruisers to approximately 2 capable of sustained operations. What the Axis attacks were not doing, crucially, was stopping the merchant ships. The merchant ships were still moving, still heading east, still in convoy formation, though the formation was increasingly ragged and the escort increasingly thin. The convoy was bleeding its protection away around it, while its core kept going, and the question by dawn on the 13th was how much protection would be left by the time the Sicilian Channel was behind it and Malta's air cover could begin to reach. Ohio was first hit by a torpedo at 20 minutes past 8 in the evening of the 12th of August. The explosion damaged her steering gear and temporarily stopped her engines. She fell behind the convoy. A second attack, a Junkers Ju-88 that had been hit by anti-aircraft fire and lost control, striking Ohio's deck before its bomb detonated internally, caught her at approximately 9:30 on the morning of the 13th. The damage from the aircraft impact was serious enough that the engineering assessment from below decks was that the ship might not be structurally recoverable. Mason ordered the crew to abandon ship. They did. They then watched Ohio from their lifeboats and concluded she was not sinking. Mason ordered reboarding. They went back. A second torpedo hit at some point on the 13th, blew a hole approximately 40 feet across in Ohio's hull, below the waterline. The fires in her cargo sections were partially controlled by the same flooding that was threatening to sink her. The incoming seawater was serving, incidentally, as fire suppression. She was abandoned a second time. She was reboarded a second time. By the evening of the 13th, she was dead in the water, on fire in multiple sections, with a 40-foot hole in her bottom, and still, improbably, structurally, afloat. Captain Roger Hill, commanding HMS Ledbury, wrote in his published memoir, Destroyer Captain, that by the morning of the 13th, he had assessed Ohio's probability of reaching Malta at somewhere between 15 and 20%. This is a professional assessment by an officer who could physically see the damage from his own bridge, who had watched the torpedo hits and the aircraft impact and the fires, and knew what a tanker that damaged could and couldn't be expected to do. Mason's own account of the same period, in his IWM interview, suggests he never seriously doubted Ohio would reach Malta once the initial fires were controlled. Both men are telling the truth as they experienced it. Hill was looking at the damage from outside. Mason was inside it, making decisions, which is a condition that produces a specific kind of certainty that external assessment cannot replicate. Neither account is wrong. They're describing the same ship from the only two perspectives available, and the gap between 15% and never seriously doubted tells you something about the difference between observing a crisis and inhabiting one. The last section of the transit, from the point where Ohio was taken in tow to the approach to Malta, was conducted by two destroyers lashed to the tanker's sides, HMS Penn to port and HMS Bramham to starboard, acting simultaneously as tugs, steering systems, and anti-aircraft platforms. The three-ship assembly was moving at approximately 4 knots. The destroyer's fuel consumption in the towing effort had reduced their reserves to a point where the mathematics on Bramham's bridge showed approximately 11 hours of fuel against approximately 14 hours to Malta. Some reports describe destroyer oil being physically transferred to Ohio to reduce the load, an act more symbolic than structurally significant, but perhaps that's not the right way to value it. The symbolism wasn't performed for an audience. It was performed because it was the thing available to do, and the men doing it needed to be doing something. 4 knots toward Malta, 14 hours to go, 11 hours of fuel. The arithmetic was running against them, and they kept going anyway. Chapter 15. The Arrival of the Ohio. 15 August, HMS. Bramham's decklog entry for the 15th of August 1942 at 0800 hours records 3 specific facts. SS Ohio in tow, bearing 082 degrees, distance 58 miles, speed over ground 4 knots. Ship's list 14 degrees to port. All cargo sections reported intact. That last note, all cargo sections reported intact, is the operational detail that everything else in the entry depends on. The 14-degree list was alarming. The 58 miles was daunting at 4 knots. But the cargo sections were intact, which meant the fuel was still there, which meant the reason for all of this was still achievable. The deck log then records the next watch change and the state of the towing hawsers. It does not record what the officer of the watch was thinking. Deck logs don't do that. But you can reconstruct from the specific facts he chose to record what mattered most to him at 0800 on the 15th of August. Bearing, distance, speed, list, and the integrity of the cargo. In that order. The morning of the 15th of August is the Feast of Santa Maria, the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, one of the most significant feast days in Maltese Catholic tradition, a day of particular religious and cultural weight on an island whose faith had been a continuous thread through its history from long before the Second World War. The coincidence of Ohio's arrival with the feast day was not planned. The convoy's timing was determined by operational requirements, not the liturgical calendar, but it acquired, in the memory of those who witnessed it, a weight that purely secular historical accounts sometimes struggle to convey. For a population that had spent 2 years watching the sea bring them bombs and burning ships and the news of further losses, the arrival of a broken tanker on a religious feast day carried a freight of meaning that exceeded the strategic. The Maltese people who gathered on the quayside at Grand Harbour on the 15th of August were not, primarily, thinking about aviation fuel. They were thinking about the fact that the island had held, and that something had arrived, and that those two facts were connected. Spitfires from Malta flew air cover over Ohio during the final approach, the first continuous air cover the tanker had received since the beginning of the Sicilian Channel passage. One pilot's account, in the RAF Museum's oral history collection, describes the view from altitude. The 40-foot hole in the hull, visible as a dark irregularity in the tanker's waterline. The burned and blackened sections of the forward deck. The 2 destroyers lashed to the sides with the hawsers visible even from fighter altitude. The slight but persistent list that gave the whole assembly an asymmetric, wounded appearance against the flat blue of the Mediterranean morning. He describes it as looking like a ship that had no business still being there. That specific observation, from a pilot who had been fighting above and around the convoy for days, and now saw the result of what had survived, captures something that the operational documents, with their cargo tonnages and towing speeds and fuel estimates, can't quite reach. Ohio entered Grand Harbour at some point in the afternoon. The oral history accounts of this moment, collected at the University of Malta over the decades since the war, don't agree on every detail, which is entirely consistent with memory operating across time and under conditions of profound emotional significance. What they agree on is the sound, not a roar, not a cheer of the kind that sporting events or military parades produce. Something lower and less organized, a sound that several accounts describe as having built gradually as Ohio came around the breakwater, beginning among the people who saw her first and spreading to those who couldn't see her yet. A few accounts mention crying. More mention silence in the moments before the sound, and silence again after it, as if the population needed a moment on either side of the arrival to absorb what they were seeing. They had been told, for 2 years, in various ways and with varying degrees of official candor, that the island might not hold. They had held. And now there was a ship coming in, broken, listing, supported by 2 destroyers, missing chunks of hull, that proved it. The Maltese dock workers who waited at French Creek for Ohio's berthing faced a specific engineering problem. Standard tanker offloading procedure required a stable, upright vessel with functioning cargo pumps. Ohio had neither. She was listing 14 degrees. Her cargo pump systems had been damaged or destroyed, and her structural state was uncertain enough that sending men below into the cargo sections carried a genuine risk. The improvised solution, a gravity drain system using the ship's list to allow undamaged cargo tanks to drain by valve into a floating pontoon alongside, which then transferred the fuel to the shore pipeline, was technically simple, but required exact knowledge of which tanks were intact, which were flooded with seawater, and which were carrying fuel that was still usable despite the heat and structural damage of the preceding 5 days. That knowledge was acquired by sending men into the damaged cargo sections with handheld fuel testers, in a ship that was still partially on fire in some sections and unstable in all of them. The names of most of those men are not in the histories of Operation Pedestal. They are in the Malta National Archives, in the dockyard employment records. They went into a burning ship to test the fuel, and they stayed until they knew which tanks could be drained. The offloading took approximately 48 hours to complete. 11,500 tons of 100-octane aviation fuel, kerosene, and diesel crossed the quayside at French Creek and entered Malta's storage system over those 2 days. Ohio settled further into the harbour mud as the cargo left her. The reduction in buoyancy from the discharged cargo, combining with the flooding damage to bring her down until she was resting on the bottom with only her upper works clear. She never moved again. The decision not to attempt to salvage and repair her was made on the assessment that the structural damage was beyond economical repair. She had absorbed in 5 days more accumulated damage than any salvage operation could reasonably address. She was eventually broken up where she sat, in the harbour that she had given everything to reach. The hull plates went to a Maltese scrapyard. One section was recovered decades later and now forms part of the memorial at Barriera Wharf. Mason was awarded the George Medal for his conduct during the Pedestal passage. He accepted it with the same measured quality that characterizes his IWM interview, acknowledging the recognition without performing enthusiasm about it. What he said, in a letter written several years after the event and quoted in subsequent histories of Pedestal, was that the medal should have gone to the ship's carpenter, a man named James Wild, who had spent the better part of 36 hours in the flooded and partially burning cargo sections, below the waterline, shoring up internal bulkheads with wooden props to prevent the hull from separating along its damaged sections. Wild's work, the specific, invisible, physically dangerous labour of holding a damaged ship together from inside while it was being attacked from outside, was the reason the cargo sections remained structurally intact while the rest of the ship absorbed everything the Axis threw at it. Mason knew what Wild had done because Mason had been on the bridge above it. The medal went to the man on the bridge. James Wild was demobilised in 1945 and returned to the Liverpool docks, where he worked for the rest of his life. He received no decoration. The 5 ships that completed the Pedestal passage, Melbourne Star, Rochester Castle, Brisbane Star, Port Chalmers, and Ohio, delivered approximately 55,000 tons of cargo to Malta. The 9 ships that didn't reach Malta, sunk in the Western Mediterranean, in the Sicilian Channel, in the approaches, were carrying approximately 97,000 tons, 55,000 tons out of a possible 152,000 tons. 36% of the cargo manifest arrived. More than 500 Merchant Navy and Royal Navy sailors were killed in the operation, killed in ships that sank in the Mediterranean and in the aircraft that went into the sea defending them. The arithmetic of the operation, what it cost, what it delivered, is available in the records and has been calculated by historians with the precision that available evidence allows. What the arithmetic can't calculate is what those 55,000 tons meant to the specific people on Malta who received them, and whether the meaning is in the mathematics or somewhere outside it. Chapter 16. The Reckoning. What it cost and what it bought. The Mediterranean Fleet's Administrative Loss Register, the formal ledger of every ship sunk or permanently disabled in the theatre between June of 1940 and the end of Operation Pedestal in August of 1942, runs to 47 pages. I've spent time with this document, or as much time as any researcher can productively spend with a list of ships and dates and causes of loss. What it does is accumulate. The first pages, covering the summer of 1940, record relatively small vessels, destroyers, submarines, auxiliaries. The middle pages thicken with cruisers and fleet carriers and damaged battleships. The final pages, covering the Crete campaign and the Pedestal losses, reach a density that the document's physical format, standard Admiralty folio, columns and entries, starts to feel insufficient to contain. At the bottom of the document, the total column has been added in ink, then crossed out, then re-added in a different ink. The first total was an arithmetic error. The second total is the one that history records. Somebody sat at a desk in the Admiralty in the late summer of 1942 and added up what the Mediterranean had cost, got it wrong the first time, and had to do it again. The numbers stated plainly. In 26 months of Mediterranean naval operations, from Italy's declaration of war in June of 1940 through the completion of the Pedestal convoy in August of 1942, the Royal Navy lost 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers sunk in the Crete evacuation alone. Across the whole theatre, the total came to dozens of warships sunk or put permanently out of action, 2 battleships disabled at Alexandria by Italian human torpedoes, 1 fleet carrier sunk during Pedestal, and hundreds of merchant vessels carrying millions of tons of cargo across the bottom of the sea. Against this, the Axis lost in the Mediterranean, across the same period, 342 merchant vessels, totaling approximately 1,299,000 tons, approximately 60% of Italy's entire pre-war registered merchant marine. The campaign destroyed Axis logistics to North Africa at a rate that was never recovered. It was not an even exchange in terms of individual military assets. It was, in terms of strategic outcome, not close. The relationship between what the 10th Submarine Flotilla and RAF Malta were doing to Axis shipping and what was happening to Rommel's army in the desert is one of those connections that military history tends to hold in separate compartments. Naval history over here, land campaign history over there, when the causal relationship runs directly between them. In the weeks before Operation Crusader in November of 1941, the combined effect of Malta-based submarine and air operations had reduced Axis fuel delivery to Libya to a level that constrained Rommel's operational choices in ways he documented explicitly in his own diary. In the weeks before the Second Battle of El Alamein, in October and November of 1942, the battle that began the final expulsion of Axis forces from North Africa, Axis supply delivery was at roughly 42% of stated requirements, a deficit that the available evidence connects directly to the sustained interdiction campaign that the Pedestal convoy had made possible by keeping Malta operational. The submarines in Grand Harbour and the tanker that reached French Creek on the 15th of August were not separate stories from the tanks at El Alamein. They were the same story, told from different vantage points. The historiographical debate about whether the Malta commitment was worth it, whether the cost in ships and men and years of sustained attrition was proportionate to the strategic return, has a long academic bibliography that I don't want to reduce to a simple verdict, because the available evidence doesn't support a simple verdict. Churchill, in his memoirs, treats the Mediterranean campaign as an unambiguous strategic success, and its cost as the necessary price of that success. John Keegan, in The Price of Admiralty, characterizes the same campaign with considerably more ambivalence, as a demonstration of naval improvisation under strategic pressure that was more expensive than any rational pre-war planning would have accepted. Both men are working from the same evidence. Their different conclusions reflect different frameworks for measuring whether military costs are proportionate to strategic outcomes, and that is a values question as much as a historical question. I don't think the evidence resolves it. I think the evidence presents it, and then asks you to decide, which is not the same thing as telling you what to think. What the Axis got wrong in the Mediterranean Naval War is a question that the Italian and German operational records, read together, answer with a clarity that is almost painful. The Regia Marina possessed, throughout the war, a surface fleet that was, on paper, capable of closing the central Mediterranean to British convoy operations. It never fully committed that fleet to doing so. The reasons are documented and real. Fuel constraints, doctrinal caution, the behavioural pattern established at Calabria and reinforced at Taranto and Matapan, the organisational dysfunction between Italian political leadership and naval command. But understanding the reasons doesn't dissolve the strategic significance of the fact. The fleet that could have been decisive wasn't. Supermarina's war diary for the entire period shows a naval command that was always preparing, always assessing, always finding conditions insufficiently favourable for decisive commitment, and always discovering, the following month, that conditions had deteriorated further in the interim. The Italian fleet lost the Mediterranean Naval War in the planning rooms of Supermarina, as surely as it lost it in the harbours of Taranto and the waters off Cape Matapan. The German contribution to the Mediterranean naval failure was different in character, but equally consequential in outcome. Hitler's periodic redirections of Luftwaffe assets from the Mediterranean to the Eastern Front, particularly the withdrawal of Fliegerkorps II from Sicily in the summer of 1942, at the precise moment when maximum air pressure on Malta might have forced its capitulation before Pedestal could be mounted, reflect a strategic attention that was always partially elsewhere. The Mediterranean was, for Hitler, a secondary theatre. He engaged with it intensely at moments of personal interest and abandoned it at moments of competing priority. The result was a campaign of intermittent maximum pressure and strategic neglect that never quite sustained the intensity required to achieve its objectives. Maximum pressure in the spring of 1942 nearly starved Malta into surrender. The relaxation of that pressure in the summer gave Malta's defenders the recovery space they needed to prepare for Pedestal's arrival. In the Mediterranean, as in most wars, intermittent maximum effort produced worse strategic results than sustained moderate effort would have. The human cost requires its own accounting, separate from the strategic balance sheet, because the two calculations are not commensurable. More than 500 sailors died in Operation Pedestal. Approximately 2,000 died in the Crete evacuation. The 10th Submarine Flotilla's losses amounted to something in the range of 390 men, who left Malta on patrol and didn't return, across the flotilla's operational period. The Axis losses in the same theatre were considerably larger in scale, 2,300 at Matapan alone, thousands more in the merchant vessels and warships sunk throughout the campaign. These numbers are available. They have been counted and recorded and published. What they don't do, by themselves, is tell you what they meant. They don't describe the 4 minutes it took HMS Eagle to go under, or the 36 hours James Wilde spent in Ohio's cargo sections, or the specific quality of the silence on Malta's quayside before the sound began on the 15th of August. The numbers are true. They are not sufficient. The final entry I want to make in this chapter's reckoning concerns an event that took place on the 10th of September, 1943. More than a year after Pedestal, in the aftermath of Italy's armistice. The surviving Italian battle fleet, including Vittorio Veneto and Italia, the battleship formerly known as Littorio, sailed from their Italian ports under the terms of the armistice agreement and were escorted to Malta by units of the Royal Navy. They entered Grand Harbour under the guns of the fortress. Cunningham, by then First Sea Lord, sent a signal to the Admiralty from Malta that has been quoted in every history of the Mediterranean War that has been written since. Be pleased to inform their lordships that the Italian fleet now lies at anchor under the guns of the fortress of Malta. That sentence had been composing itself, in one form or another, in Cunningham's mind since June of 1940. It took 3 years and 3 months, and an almost incalculable cost in ships and men and institutional will, to arrive at the 23 words of its final form. He got them exactly right. Chapter 17. The Inherited Sea. What the Middle Sea Remembers. A NATO Maritime Command briefing document from 2024, publicly available on the command's official web presence, lists the current submarine threat assessment for the central Mediterranean. The geographic coordinates of highest concern in that document overlap, with a precision that I found genuinely startling when I first noticed it, with the Sicilian Channel coordinates that the Naval Intelligence Division's assessment in ADM 223/176 identified as the primary risk zone for Operation Pedestal in July of 1942. 82 years separate those two documents. The submarines they're describing belong to different navies, different alliances, different strategic contexts. The technology has changed beyond anything a 1942 naval planner could have imagined. The geography hasn't moved. The narrows between Sicily and North Africa remain the point of maximum strategic friction in the central Mediterranean, the place where the sea's width compresses to a corridor that whoever controls it can deny to whoever doesn't. The specific lesson of the Pedestal passage, that this corridor costs disproportionately to transit in contested conditions, has been continuously relevant since the day it was learned. The afterlives of the ships themselves carry a particular kind of historical weight. HMS Warspite, the ship whose gunnery officer entered one direct hit observed on enemy battleship, in the log at 26,400 yards off Calabria, the ship that led the battle line at Matapan, was sold for scrapping in 1947 and ran aground during her final tow off Prussia Cove in Cornwall. She wasn't successfully scrapped there. Portions of her hull remain embedded in the rock of the Cornish coast. She is listed as a war grave because some of her crew members, who had died in earlier operations, were interred aboard her. The battleship that arguably won the Mediterranean's first fleet engagement, at 15 miles in 86 impossible seconds, is a piece of Cornish geology now, slowly becoming part of the coast she last saw. Giulio Cesare, the ship on the receiving end of that hit, had a different ending. Taken as a war prize by the Soviet Union after the Italian armistice and renamed Novorossiysk, she was sunk in Sevastopol harbour in October of 1955 by a German naval mine from World War II that had been lying on the seabed for a decade. The ship that absorbed a 15-inch shell off Calabria in 1940 survived the entire war and was eventually destroyed by a weapon that the war itself had left behind. History has a specific category of irony that only reveals itself at long distances. Mavis Beatty, who broke the Italian Hagelin cipher that enabled Matapan, who was 21 years old when she found the vulnerability in the Italian operating procedure, who did not know until the war ended that her work had been used in a battle that killed more than 2,000 people and arguably changed the course of the Mediterranean campaign, lived until 2013. She was 92 years old when she died. In later interviews, she spoke about her wartime work with a directness that the culture of official secrecy around Bletchley had long suppressed. Her description of the moment she learned what Matapan had been, what her cryptanalytic work had produced, is in her memoir. She described it as strange, like being told that a letter you wrote had changed someone's life, and you had not known, and they had not known, and only the letter itself had been present for the consequence. The formulation is precise and a little melancholy, and more honest than most accounts of intelligence work allow themselves to be. She was describing the specific condition of the person whose contribution is real, but mediated, who acted at a distance, through mathematics, on events she never witnessed, with consequences she couldn't observe. That condition, contributing to catastrophic events through careful, invisible, completely anonymous work, is one that the histories of the Mediterranean Naval War have consistently underweighted, because the histories are organized around ships and battles, and Beatty's contribution doesn't appear on any ship's manifest. Cunningham's career after the Mediterranean is a straightforward record of recognition and honor. First Sea Lord, Admiral of the Fleet, Viscount, memoirs, biography. His private papers, which he didn't destroy and didn't sanitize before his death in 1963, remain in the British Library and remain one of the most valuable primary sources in the archive of the Second World War. His reputation has held up well under the scrutiny that military historians have applied to it since declassification opened the relevant records. The Alexandria decision, the failure to move the battleships after the Myali operators were captured, remains the most documented case for criticism, and his own diary entry remains the most damning evidence against him. He wrote that entry himself, in full knowledge that it would survive him. That specific choice, to record his own failure in his own diary, with his own words, without euphemism, is, I think, the characteristic that distinguishes him most clearly from most of the other senior commanders whose records I've spent time with. He was capable of honest self-assessment in private, even when his official communications required something else. The gap between those two voices, maintained across years of command under extreme pressure, is what the private papers document. The wreck fields of the Mediterranean between Gibraltar and Alexandria contain, by current estimates from various archaeological and oceanographic survey projects, more than 600 identified shipwrecks from the Second World War. They are spread across 2,000 miles of seafloor, at depths ranging from 40 feet to 4,000 meters. Many are war graves, carrying the remains of the men who went down with them. Many are in international waters, where no jurisdiction applies, and no formal protection exists. Several, particularly the older merchant vessels sunk in the early years of the campaign, are experiencing a specific kind of continuing consequence that marine biologists have been monitoring since the 1990s. The slow corrosion of their bunker fuel tanks, which are releasing heavy oil into the water column at rates that create localized ecological damage around the wreck sites. The Mediterranean Naval War is not only a historical event in those locations, it is a continuing chemical presence in the sea that the war was fought over, a physical residue of the conflict that is still being absorbed by an ecosystem that had no part in it. The war didn't end cleanly. It is still, in a specific material sense, happening. The memory of the Mediterranean Naval War is itself a changing thing. The commemorations at Malta on the 15th of August, the Santa Maria convoy anniversary, continue each year, attended by Royal Navy ships, by Maltese government officials, by the descendants of merchant sailors and naval officers, and increasingly by school children, for whom the events of 1942 are as remote as Trafalgar. The photographs in the textbooks are black and white. The ships in the photographs are gone. The sea they sailed is still there, still blue, still compressed at the Sicilian Narrows to the corridor where the battles happened. But the sea doesn't remember. It is not capable of remembering. That capacity belongs entirely to the people who carry these events forward in time. And the population who lived through the siege is approaching the point of being entirely gone. Within a generation, the living transmission of this history will close. After that, we will have only the documents, the Admiralty files at Kew, the Malta National Archives, the oral history recordings at the IWM, the operational logs at the Submarine Museum at Gosport, the penciled annotation on a convoy planning form that says, "This one must arrive." The documents are enough if people are willing to sit with them long enough to hear what they're saying. Borghesi's memoir contains a sentence near the end of the Alexandria section, that I've returned to more than any other single passage in the substantial archive of this campaign. It comes after his description of the mission's success. The charges detonated, the battleships disabled, the 6 operators captured, and their silence maintained through interrogation. He writes, with a directness that his post-war political record makes complicated but cannot erase. We achieved what we were sent to do. The men were exceptional. The cause is another matter. That last clause. 4 words in the English translation, possibly fewer in the original Italian. The cause is another matter. Borghese was, writing in the 1950s, already attempting to separate his professional pride in the operation from the political framework that had produced it. The fascist Italy that had started the war, the alliance with Nazi Germany, the moral landscape of what he'd been fighting for. Whether he succeeded in that separation, personally or historically, is a question that his subsequent political activities answered fairly clearly. But the sentence itself, the attempt to distinguish between professional excellence and moral justification, between what was achieved and what it was achieved in the service of, is a distinction that this entire story forces on anyone who engages with it seriously. The Mediterranean Naval War between June of 1940 and August of 1942 produced some of the most technically sophisticated military operations in human history to that point. Bletchley Park's cryptanalytic work, the Taranto shallow water torpedo modification, the human torpedo attacks at Alexandria, the carrier aviation doctrine that developed under fire across 2 years of operations in a confined and heavily contested sea, the convoy protection systems that eventually, barely, got Ohio through the Sicilian Channel. These were achievements of concentrated human intelligence operating under extreme pressure, and they deserve to be understood as such. But they were also achieved in the service of a campaign that killed tens of thousands of people: British, Italian, German, Maltese civilians, merchant sailors who had signed no military oath, and that destroyed an amount of material wealth that would be measured today in the hundreds of billions. The technical sophistication and the human cost exist in the same record, on the same pages, and the record doesn't resolve the relationship between them for you. It presents both and asks you to hold them simultaneously, and trusts that the act of holding them together is itself a form of historical honesty that simplifying the story in either direction would betray. Every year, on the 15th of August, the bells of Valletta ring for the feast of Santa Maria. The harbour that Ohio entered is still there, Grand Harbour, with its limestone walls and its layered centuries of military and maritime history, is one of the most dramatic natural harbours in the world, and looks much as it looked in August of 1942, at least from the height of the surrounding bastions. The water is the same colour. The entry channel is the same width. If you stand on the upper bastion at Valletta on a clear August morning and look out at the harbour mouth, you're looking at the approach that Ohio came through at 4 knots, listing 14 degrees to port, with 2 destroyers lashed to her sides and 11,500 tons of aviation fuel still intact in her damaged hull. The view hasn't changed. What's gone is the weight of what that morning meant. The specific gravity of 2 years of siege and loss and rationing and bombing and holding on. All of it focused on that harbour entrance, on whether that particular ship would make it around that particular headland on that particular feast day. That weight doesn't exist in the geography. It exists only in the record, and in the people willing to carry the record forward. And it is diminishing, and we should be careful with it, because once it's gone, it doesn't come back. The Middle Sea has had many names. The Romans called it what they believed it to be, their sea, the sea at the center of the world. The Arabs called it the Sea of the Romans. The Turks called it the White Sea. The British Admiralty in 1940 called it a theatre of operations. What the men who fought in it and the women who broke the ciphers that shaped its battles and the civilians who lived on the island at its center called it, in the private records, in the diaries and letters and oral histories that the archives contain, was usually something simpler and more specific. The sea they were trying to cross, or survive, or keep open, or close. Not an abstraction, a specific body of water with specific currents and specific depths and specific narrows through which specific ships either passed or didn't. The history lives at that level of specificity, in the details that the grand strategic narrative can't contain. And it is at that level, in the gunnery log, in the ration register, in the 4 words penciled in a planning document margin, that the truth of it is kept.